Yo, what's up? It's Jimmy on from Glitchy Thumbs. Today we have character set number 3. This is a new character set. We get to see a bunch of new characters. I hope you guys liked the characters from character set 1 and character set 2. Let me know what you think in the comments for any of the videos. If you enjoyed it, let me know. Subscribe if you haven't. That'd be great. Appreciate that. Let's get to the first character, character 3.1. I'm gonna give you a hint. It's gonna be some sort of bear. Let's get to the video. I open up Blender, and with each new character set, we need to set up the scene with our reference. Hopefully I've got this down this time around. Turn on the shortcut add-on so we can see the hotkeys and the mouse clicks. Makes everything so much easier. I don't have to really mention it at times. You guys can always refer to the bottom of the screen, either on the right side or on the left side. Let's set up the reference. I drop in the character set number 3. You can see my character designs have started improving during this time. I think my line work was getting a little bit better, like actual characters were starting to form, even though they're still abstract. But at the same time, you can visually tell what they are now, at least most of them. When I drop in the reference, first thing I did was select medium point. That gets the cursor to be right in the middle of the reference. So it's easier to move to the middle of the screen because that's where we're going to be creating our 3D model for character 3.1, which is going to be this bear looking person on the left. He has no body, it's just a head, but that just allows us to make a humanoid body. This is going to be the second humanoid body that I'll be working on. We need to make sure I can lock the reference. So I bring down this drop down menu and click this arrow toggle and rename the empty to left reference because all the characters or most of the characters for this is going to be facing left. I drop in another reference. You see, even though I chose medium point, it worked earlier, but when I click on the reference again, you can see the cursor is to the far right. So it's a little bit weird why that happens. I really don't know. I haven't really looked into it much because this problem isn't a big issue. It doesn't stop me from creating my characters. It's just annoying that the cursor isn't always directly in the middle, and I have no idea why. If you know why, leave it in the comments. That would be great. I'll probably figure it out at some point, but I'm not going to spend all this time trying to figure it out. I'm just trying to get this reference in place in the middle. That way we can start modeling our characters. What I did was go to Object, mirrored on the X global. This faces the characters from left to right. I like to set everything up before I start modeling. I want to make all my characters facing left to right, but the way I drew it, some of them are facing right to left. So that's why I have 2 references in case I need to switch between the 2, and it'll be so much easier to just turn on the toggle. That's just how I do it. Normally people have 2 references where they have a front view of the character and a side view, but I don't have that. I just drew one sketch of the character set, and that's what we're going to use. I normally just visualize the rest of the body on how it looks. So that's how I do my 3D modeling. And that's also the fun part of being creative as well, because you really have to think how your shape's going to be because you don't have the full idea of how it exactly looks like. You just have some sort of concept art and you base it off of that. That's how I'm going to do most of my characters because it's just easier that way. There's really no reason to draw another side of the sketch because I'm going to spend too much time on that. I'd rather spend my time actually creating the 3D model so that we can use it in build blocks so we can build some sort of mechanic. I've been trying to get the ball rolling as best as I can, trying to keep up with this momentum. I'm feeling good about the videos I'm creating. I'm feeling good about the characters, feeling good about the ideas. It's taking some time, but you just got to keep your foot on the pedal when you get this much momentum, and that's what I'm doing. I spent a little bit of time trying to figure this out for the cursor on the reference. You see what I mean? To me, this is wasting time because I'm supposed to be modeling right now, but I'm taking the time to actually try to solve the cursor issue. The only reason why I'm using the cursor is because it's easier to demonstrate what I'm doing. You can see the cursor on the screen. It's obvious that I'm using it to move, but in Blender, you can have your key map set to the default, which is G for grab, R for rotate, and S to scale, but I don't have it set up like that. I have it where W is set to the move cursor, E is set to the rotate cursor, R is to the scale cursor, and D is set to extrude. And that's just easier to use for my fingers, easier to press. It's visible on the screen on what I'm doing. I probably mentioned this before, but that's okay. So that's the reason for that. Yeah, setting up the reference does take some time. Should be fairly straightforward, but I don't think it was for me during this time. I don't even know when I drew these, or when I modeled these characters, actually. I should look for the actual date. It's actually been some time. This is how I've resolved this issue, I guess. So on the right side, there's an offset for X and an offset for Y. If you adjust these values, you can move the empty, which is the reference, and it will move to the cursor. That's how I was aligning my reference. This should work, but sometimes you do things and it doesn't work. So we'll just see what happens in the video. Since I have two references, I have to do both. Adjust the offset to align with the move cursor. Hopefully this worked this time for this video and the future characters. You see what I mean? I grab the cursor in the middle and I move the reference. The cursor is still in the previous location, but the reference moved. So that was the annoying part about this, because even though you do the right steps, it doesn't follow. I guess I should just look this up, but I don't spend much time trying to resolve problems like this. I'd rather spend it on something much more important, which is making sure we get to our end goal, find a character we like, build a game mechanic, build a full game. That's the end goal. So everything else in between is all a learning process to get to that end goal. But you got to do what you got to do, right? Wow, I spent a lot of time on this reference. Normally I would skip all this, but I guess it was bothering me at the time. But this time I grab the reference, I move it to the right side, and the cursor works this time. We'll see. I'll have to refer back to this to see what went wrong. I rename this to right reference. Now we have two of our references that I can just switch between the two by clicking one of the toggles, and that's how I have this set up. We can't forget the opacity for the reference. Turn it down to 0.35 or whichever value, just so it's not the focal point in Blender, so we can actually focus on the 3D model itself and the reference isn't getting in the way. This is character 3.1. He looks like some sort of bear. I believe he's a bear. Very abstract, not very symmetric. But we're definitely going to be making the head much more symmetric this time. The last character, character 2.5, Bug Boots, was a little bit deformed with the head because I didn't focus too much on using the mirror modifier for the head. This time, that's definitely on my mind for creating character 3.1. I had a plane, rotate it 90 degrees, scale it down, grab the right vertices, extrude to the right of the reference as far as you can. You have to eyeball this. I'm trying to get the entire head with a long plane this time. Grab the left vertice, extrude all the way to the left, grab the top vertices, extrude all the way to the top, and this grabs the entire head without the ears, of course. I think I do the ears separate. I make multiple loop cuts in the middle, making sure all the rows are a similar size to each other. I make a loop cut in the left and the right in columns. The right side is a little bit uneven, but that's okay. We can always adjust the edge loops at any time to have all the squares have the same size. This is all entirely up to you how you want to do it. There's no right or wrong answer. As long as you get to the final character, that's all that really matters, right? If you get something functional and it's working, it didn't take you that much time, you're able to get your idea across for this bear character, then you're right on track on whatever you were doing. I decided to delete these vertices on the right side so I can pull out some of these faces. This is a alignment issue, for me at least, because I want to make everything symmetric as best as possible early on. That way we don't have any issues with UV unwrap. Also, this is just better topology for your low poly models. You don't have all your edges and vertices all over the place. This just makes the other processes so much easier to work with if you get this right the first time. So that was my thought process during this time using the plane method. If you watch the previous videos, this was a little tweak that I did to the plane method. I was not creating a big plane like this and keeping all the edges organized like this. I only think about it because we need to pull the edges out later to get some curvature. Now, with the vertices on the outside sticking out like this, you can just grab them in and align it to the reference, or if there's a lot of dead space, you can just select the face and delete them. That's entirely up to you how you want to do that. That's just an option. But now we have this small area that we need to fill in. So you have to decide whether that was the best solution or not. I decided it wasn't, so I undid that and kept the faces. It just makes more sense. Instead, I just grabbed vertices and dragged them in closer. So now we can just wrap around the reference to get character 3.1's bear-shaped head. This is all experimental, of course, on how I'm doing all this. I have no right or wrong answer for how to create your 3D model. This is just how I'm doing it. There's probably many ways to do it within Blender. If you watch enough tutorials on this, you'll probably find different variations on how to get to the same results. Some might be better with better topology. Some might be faster, but you just have to put in the time at the end of the day. So that's what I'm doing. I'm just sticking to one method and trying to improve, make that much more efficient as I progress with each character. That's my focus point for all my new characters. I slowly do it because you have to learn, and then you have to implement, and then you have to observe, and then you have to analyze to see how you can do this better the next time around. 3D modeling takes quite a bit of time to create your characters. Sometimes you don't even use them at the end of the day. Like some of my characters, I didn't use them other than to learn the process, but where's the game mechanics? So that's what I think about. Sometimes that's going to happen. You're going to have these characters and then nothing comes about it. There's going to be no ideas that come to your mind. Even if you try your hardest, it doesn't happen. I try not to force it. Whenever things come to me in a flow, it means that idea is much more stronger than the ones that I force. So you gotta let it come naturally sometimes. That's just how I do things. Like how I have all this content to narrate and talk about is because all the stuff that I did was all in the flow. I didn't really try that hard to even think about the content I was making for the day. I just recorded what I did. Now it's time to explain everything, whether it's in narration form, devlogs, whatever. As long as I put some videos out of what I did, that's all that matters. All this stuff helps me out because I get to rewatch everything that I did and observe, see how that's gonna benefit me now for my current characters that I'm working on. Also, you get to see my progress and you get to see the journey that I took to get to this point. I think it's pretty cool to be able to watch this because not many people share it. If some people do, they're already light years ahead. They look like they've been creating characters or drawing characters or sketching characters or making characters for a very long time. It's like super detailed. It looks too good. Like they spent so much time on it. I like the idea of seeing someone who was a beginner, like I'm talking beginner, and that's pretty much me, and how they progressed over time, whether they got better, how did they get better, what was their thought process during that time. Like I really think that stuff is very important because you can learn a lot about how someone works, whether that's something that's going to be useful to you or not. I honestly find it useful for me when I see people create things from the beginning. I get inspired. I like seeing it. So that's how I learn. I pick up new frameworks. I apply it to myself. And then sometimes I break it down to as simple as possible, step by step, so that I learn the process at my speed, at my own pace. So that's how I've been learning all of this, and I'm still learning. If you're trying to create characters in Blender, hopefully this is all helpful to you because this has been a pretty fun project that I've been working on. I've actually never done something like this, so it's cool to see it. It's cool to narrate it. It's cool to make the content. Also, video editing is something new to me too. Well, not like super new, but I'm saying there's a lot of things that I'm a beginner at, and it's just fun to actually be hands-on on everything that you do and then put it out into the world just to see what people think about it. But yeah, back to creating character 3.1's head. I made a loop cut in the middle and then selected the vertices on the right side. I deleted them so that we have half our plane, which is half of the head of the bear character. I added a mirror modifier because again, we only need to do half of the work, which speeds up our workflow time as long as we stay on task and not run into any hiccups along the way. I've gotten to a point where there's less hiccups, but there's only more complex problems now. There's so much to learn in Blender to make everything much more faster, and that's the progress I've been trying to get better at. I removed the modifier for some reason and select these left vertices on the outside because it looks like I want to extrude the mesh where the ears are. It makes more sense to make the ears now. That way when we mirror to the other side, the ears and the head are mirrored. So that's the thought process. Yeah, it takes me some time to register what's going on, even though I was the one that made these characters, but you forget, trust me, all the stuff you have to do in Blender and all the stuff you have to do in Buildbox makes you forget. That's why it's good to record everything. And you really don't forget anything. You just have to recall from your memory what happened, which is normally what happens when I look at these videos. I can tell what I'm about to do, but at the same time, sometimes I'm wrong because there's always a time when I'm like undoing things. I should rewatch these videos first before narrating it, but I think it's just fun going in without knowing what the video is about. I have a lot of videos and I need to narrate all of them and do some voiceovers, but I think it's much more fun watching a workflow and I just have to talk about it. But I was the one who recorded this workflow. I've always thought about actually talking and recording at the same time, but for some reason it takes a lot of mental energy to do that. Like, it's easier for me to just focus on talking versus talking and creating models in Blender, if that makes sense. Like, I have to do one thing at a time in order to excel at it, and then the content just becomes so much better when it's separate. Like, I have the workflow that I recorded. During that time, I just completely just focused on creating the 3D model and I didn't focus on talking or anything like that. I just had music on. That just helps my creative flow, gets me in that mode. And then I have another time when I'm doing the narrating and talking, which is what I'm doing now. And then you combine the two and it actually turns out to be a pretty good video. So that's how I've been doing my video editing. If you guys were curious about that, I find that works so much better for me. Some people do it differently. I don't know how other people do it, but I just find this so much easier for me to do. Plowing through all these videos, talking as much as I can on whatever I'm watching, trying to stay on track, of course. Sometimes I go off on a tangent, but it happens. But you know, information is important anyways. So maybe some people will find this useful that I talk about certain things. That's just going to help my self-development anyways. All right, for the ears, I did a loop cut in the middle. Selected these two vertices, right click and subdivide. So I get a vertex in the middle. Did it also on the left side. And I'm doing it also on the loop cuts. And then I undid that. See, I don't know why that happens sometimes when I do certain things and then I undo it. But what was the reason? It looked right. Maybe I had a better solution. The other solution is to do a loop cut the normal way. But if you do a loop cut this way, it actually cuts all the faces in that column. I was probably trying to avoid that, but that's what happens. You can't really choose specific faces to do it on unless you manually do it with subdivide and knife. Otherwise, if you do a loop cut the normal way, it will cut into all the faces in that row or column. That's a decision you have to make. Always think about the topology of your mesh because you don't want to make all these random cuts throughout your mesh and it ruins your UVs later on. That part's important to have your textures applied correctly on top of your 3D mesh. Otherwise, you're going to have all this weird textures and stretching and you don't want that. This is around the eyes as well. So that makes the UVs very small. If you don't want specific edges, maybe in your shape, you can always dissolve them by selecting them and then right click dissolve edges. So that's an option. At this point in the video, I'm still trying to get better at the topology, more so of the reasoning, because when I do stuff, I don't really look for the correct way of doing things. I just look for a way to do things. If it works, then it worked for me. I don't know if I'm doing the right thing or my solution is the best solution. That's something I definitely need to look into in terms of Blender and topology. I just find that my characters all are coming out how I want it. I'm just going to stick with that and go with it. That's usually how I do things. I've always been an entrepreneur. I try to move as quick as possible. When I have an idea, I try to execute that idea as best as I can, as quick as I can. That way, I'm building up as much momentum as possible. This is going to take a lot of time to do, but I'm not really thinking about that. I just think about, hey, let's finish the task for today. If we don't, we have time tomorrow and the next day and the next day. I've been making pretty good progress so far. I feel like everything is coming along just fine. I aligned these vertices around the ear after getting rid of some of those edge loops on the face. During this time, I know to keep bigger faces for areas that I might draw on, which is going to be the eyes possibly on the texture itself. That's something to always make a note of. If you're texturing your 3D mesh normally by just painting, it's good to have low poly designs that have large faces because it just makes the textures easier to apply on. At least I found sometimes you want your model to be more 3D-ish. The eyes are sometimes going to be a UV sphere anyways. So you have to make that decision on your own, how you want your character, and that can always change depending on what you see and visualize for your character. Maybe you have a specific art style that you stick to, and that's perfect. But for me, I go with the flow. I don't have a specific art style. I guess my art style is super abstract, like line art, very solid colors, at least right now. And as I progress, it gets a little bit more complex, I think. So far, the characters that I work on, I think it's still super simple. I really like the line art type style. It's very simple, gets the idea across, not too much texturing at the moment. Definitely expanding my colors for my color palette, but I still go with the grayscale when I start off. That's just how I think. I want to be able to see the characters in grayscale with the shading first. Anything I come up with all happens in grayscale, and then I apply the colors on top, see what colors I want for my characters. I'm aligning these vertices as best as I can. You can see during this time, my thought process is to make sure all the vertices and edges are really aligned. This is just good practice to start building that habit for yourself, making good topology for your 3D models. If you build that habit early, the correct way, then you don't have to worry about fixing your bad habits, because you'll just revert to the correct way of doing things. At least I think this is the correct way. I guess I like organizing things. At least it seems like I like to organize by the way I see myself labeling everything in terms of the character names, the folders, the FBX files. I guess I like to organize things as best as I can. It's just easier to distinguish and separate from everything. Since there's so many files you have to think about, it's really good to organize so that you can refer back to at any time and not have to worry about what this file is or what you exactly did. I subdivide to create another vertex on the right side, and then I knife from the top vertex to the vertex we just created. Now we can get rid of this triangle polygon by deleting the face. That makes everything super simple. I do use the knife quite a bit in the upcoming videos, I believe. I think this is when I start implementing that process, at least from my memory. I think that's what happens because of the way the videos are heading. I guess that's a little bit of foreshadowing. I can just always look at the videos ahead of time, but I like to keep a little bit of surprise and wonder for myself. It's just more fun to do it that way because you guys don't know what I'm talking about, but also I don't even know what I'm going to be talking about. I'm just talking. That's the fun part. They're trying to make everything as fun as possible. Who doesn't like just talking about their work or their projects? That's just the best part. I also knife this corner polygon of the ear, and that gives us a very detailed ear. And this is looking pretty awesome. We have half of the head pretty much done here. We just need to apply the mirror modifier to get the other half. That's what happens in Blender when you're thinking about your 3D models. You're always thinking about what the other half is going to look like first. You know you don't have to do the entire shape. You can just mirror it to the other side. Sometimes you want to add different features, like things that aren't symmetric. That kind of ruins the mirror modifier method. I think any additional details should be added after the mirror modifier. It's just much more smarter that way. Before I use the mirror modifier, wait, did I use the mirror modifier? I always lose track of myself. Oh, I see what happened. So I applied the mirror modifier very early. I didn't even adjust the middle part. So when I actually applied it, there's extra vertices in the middle, which isn't correct. Normally we have to turn on clipping so that the middle vertices can connect with each other, but I didn't do that this time. I just grabbed that edge loop and bring it to the middle. The edge loop on the left side, I deleted it. I did that because I didn't like how that looked. But instead I went to my quick favorites, turned on target wheeled, just moved this edge loop to the middle so that those vertices are wielded together. This is the bear head. Now it's much more symmetric. Doing it this way, both sides are the same. We don't have to worry about any issues for the shape. If you want to extend it, you can always grab the faces that you need on the right or the left and then just move it. Again, it doesn't have to be identical to my reference. The reference is only there to guide us. That's how I think about it most of the time. For me, I definitely need to see something to create. Otherwise, if I'm starting from a blank project, it's really hard for me to just think of something. I definitely need some references, some ideas to get my mind going on what I'm going to make. That's how I work best. I forgot to move the reference further back so that we have space that's just for the 3D mesh, which is normally in front of the reference. I have to make sure to move this back for the left and the right side. The first character of every set is normally going to be a lot of setting up. Once that's done, we're able to focus on the other characters without having to worry about setting up the reference. Now that I have my mesh that I like for the head, select it, extrude, do about half the width that I like. I delete the faces in the back, apply all transforms, which zeroes everything out to original. Apply quick origin to get the origin back into the middle. I don't know why I thought of it this way. I actually saw a video on YouTube where they extended it all the way and then applied a subdivision surface modifier. I don't know why I didn't do that, because to me that should work. Actually should try it. I don't know if I tried it in any of my characters. I don't remember doing that way. I didn't really think about it. I just stick to one thing. I also need to save this project because this is a new character set. Call it the same thing, but increment it, characters 3, and it's separated in its own characters 3 folder, just like how I like it, organized as best as it can. Somewhat still messy, but still organized. Apply a mirror modifier, this time in the y-axis. You see I'm actually moving the left side as close as I can to the right side. I don't know why I didn't do that for half of the head earlier. That would make sense. That's the same process. When you're actually looking at different things, it feels like it's a different method that you're doing, if that makes sense. Sometimes if it's not a method that I'm familiar with or that I've done before, I guess my brain goes towards something else. This process I'm familiar with because I always do this all the time, where I mirror half of the shape, select the middle vertices, making sure clipping's on so that it's connected. So this is what I'm normally familiar with. The head is coming along just nicely. This one is actually much more symmetric than the previous character's head. Bug Boots was actually pretty cool though. If you haven't seen that video, check it out. For character 2.5, you can just search that up for the Blender and build box. I thought that character came out pretty good. Considering the different things that I learned in those videos, I think it was a pretty good video that set the tone for a lot of future characters. You can learn a whole lot from that character. That's how my character's head is symmetric in this character, because I did it very deformed and not symmetric in the previous character. Also introduced that humanoid body. Now that's something that I can always do for my sketches that just have heads. I can always add a humanoid body to them. That way we can always use Mixamo with the different preset animations they have. That just gives us more variety on different ways to use all these characters. I grab these middle edges and do an edge slide. We're creating the outer curvature first. Now, the edge slide was also new to the process. I just used to pull out the edges to create the round shape around the character itself. I started doing the edge slide. With the edge slide around the 3D mesh, it does pull in some of the faces that you don't want to be pulled in. So that's entirely up to you if you want to keep it that way. Sometimes you want to manually pull it back out. It doesn't look as good. It just creates that weird dent into your 3D model. And the dent I'm talking about is like where his forehead is. To me, that doesn't look good, but when you do shade smooth, can't really tell. I grab these edges on the right side and do an edge slide. You can see I'm specifically selecting certain edges and doing an edge slide first. That way we're slowly doing edge slides around the 3D mesh, just focusing on making sure all the edges have the curvature that I like. I could have typed in some sort of value to make sure everything is the same. I think I do. As I'm doing the edge slide, I type in 0.05, which is usually something I always type in. That keeps everything of the same size. If some vertices appear like this, you have to adjust them manually. This is what happens normally during the edge slide portion. You have to manually fix things to make sure your 3D model is rounded. I probably should have did a edge loop right there. That way it doesn't have that dent. There's not that much subdivisions there. It's a little bit squarish where the forehead is. I did a loop cut on the right and the left. They didn't go entirely to the top. From here, you can knife from your vertice to connect the two. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Normally I just knife straight up. This probably ruins the topology, but that's okay. It's just one vertex, so don't worry too much about that as you're creating your character. I really don't know if I'm building bad habits in Blender. I mean, if I am, let me know in the comments and hopefully I'll be able to adjust that. But my characters have been coming out fine. Not really an issue again for me. A lot of the blocking out portion of creating character 3.1 is going to be organizing, making sure everything is aligned early on. This could just be my perfectionism kicking in, trying to make everything perfect. That all depends. There's different ways to do everything. I was just spending my time making sure the blocking out was done correctly so we don't have to worry about it too much for UV unwrap and texture painting. I decided to cut half of the shape again, do a mirror in the X and Y this time. So it's mirroring to the right side, but also in the front as well. This is a good time to do this. If you make changes on any of the edges or vertices, it will be applied to the right side. Definitely think about that for your 3D mesh. Otherwise, you're going to have to do the work twice, especially for the edge slides. Sometimes I notice this way too late. I've already worked around the entire 3D mesh. I forgot, oh, I could have just turned on the mirror modifier. So I guess if you plan ahead, you don't have to worry about this, but I like to just get right in, get hands on, just go with the flow. The curvature around the outside looks pretty good. Now we can actually pull out these edge loops in the front. Since it's mirrored, I only have to do half of the work, pulling out the edge loop in the columns. You see what I mean? I could have did this for my early characters actually, where I just pull out the edges like this. I didn't have to go from the far left to the far right. I could have just mirrored half of the shape, but I think the previous characters wasn't symmetric like this character. Probably that's the reason why I couldn't do it. It only works if half of the mesh is symmetric. Blocking out actually takes a pretty long time. I don't know if you guys know this, but I'm actually like speeding up a lot through the videos. So when you guys watch it, it's actually like a time lapse, but me talking over it. Most of the time, the blocking out is taking an hour or two, if you guys want to know the exact time it takes. So when I see videos on YouTube talking about creating low poly model in 5 minutes, it's because it's a time lapse. When you actually go and create the character yourself, that video is probably going to be an hour or two of your time. Unless you're like super skilled at what you do, then you probably cut that down in half or even faster. For me, nope, I'm still in the beginning stages. I've definitely improved for sure. I can probably create some complex characters. I'm still working through some inefficiencies on myself. I think we're almost finished with the blocking out of the head. We do have to pull out these edges in the rows to give it more of a circular shape. This bear head actually looks pretty good. Considering the low poly, it looks pretty good. I decided to wield these vertices together. Doesn't make sense to have two vertices next to each other like that. Cleans up the topology just a little bit. Sometimes you want to look around your 3D model and look for specific edges that don't need to be there, like this edge right here. I felt like we didn't need that. Unless you're really going for that low poly look, then keep some of your edges. It helps create the different triangle polygons. Look at your 3D model from different perspectives to see if the curvature is correct. Like for the ear, this definitely shouldn't have been dented in this area. Should be a little bit more circular. Definitely should be more rounded. So you have to manually go through and edit. Sometimes this happens. You want to get your 3D model as best as you can. At least this is part of the improvement process. Once you nail down the framework that works for you, that part becomes easier and allows your brain to think about other things it can do to improve this 3D model. You can tell in the previous characters that I worked on, a lot of my time was trying to nail this plane method. I was still learning it as I go, but now that I'm familiar with the process and I've been using it for quite some time, I honestly don't really think about it as much as on autopilot. And then my brain thinks about other things on how to improve the 3D model, like I'm doing here. This helps your character design overall in the long term. Every character, you can definitely see the improvements. And I think it's just going to be fun to get to these characters that I want to work on, actually. Sometimes I feel like I'm not ready to work on them. I need more practice. So that's why I'm practicing on the lower level sketches. I can make all the mistakes that I want and not have to worry about it. They were just simple sketches anyways. I'm just practicing. That's how I think about it. Otherwise, if I just force it and just go straight to my complex characters, I'm probably going to run into a lot of problems and then feel discouraged to work on more complex characters. I try not to do that. I don't want to discourage myself throughout this entire process. I want to make sure everything is getting completed as best as I can do it at this time while it's still super fun for me. I want to keep this energy going. This looks new in the blocking out portion. I'm actually grabbing the edge loop around the character this time and pulling that out to give it even more of a curvature around the character. I don't think I did that before. I just kept it flat. I guess for the bear character, it looks pretty good to do it this way. I'm looking at this 3D model and I'm thinking I could have also used this like a balloon as well. At least that's what I'm seeing when I'm watching this video. The bear head can actually be like a balloon head, and I can attach some sort of string to the bottom, and then we don't need to create a humanoid body. Maybe that can actually be an idea that I add to character 3.1. Maybe have some sort of balloon game where we have to inflate them or pop them. All the balloons have these bear faces. It could also be other animals. That's what I'm thinking about. I just really see a balloon with this bear head for character 3.1. A balloon game. That would actually be pretty fun. Maybe this character can be a balloon character with a bear face. That's a possibility. I didn't think of that before. The balloon is going through different environments. You have to avoid running into sharp things. Otherwise, you'll pop and that game over. It's actually a pretty good game idea. Maybe I will consider looking into building that. Since we have a mirror, I can always uncheck the x-axis. We can see inside of the shape if we need to. This is actually a good idea to be able to look into your 3D models. In case you have unnecessary faces within the middle, you can uncheck the axis with the mirror modifier. I know we had that issue with some previous characters where we had to find specific faces and delete them in the UV editing process. So this is a good way to do it. I think I'm trying to extend the shape of the 3D model because the shape is too small. I unchecked clipping and selected the vertices on the left so that we can pull this out so that we can get a bigger shape for the bear balloon. I like that. It's actually a good idea. I haven't thought about that just yet until now. This is what happens when I look at things and visualize different ideas on what I can do. I didn't have an idea for this character. I just created it and that was it. I select the middle vertices, turn clipping on, connect them. This way we have a bigger head shape. Another idea that I had for the balloon would be every time you press the screen, the balloon will deflate, but it will actually push you forward in the air to the next area. There will probably be some checkpoints where you can inflate again, or you can let go of the screen and it will inflate again. And you have to get to the end of the level. This is taking place in the sky of some sort. So it's kind of like someone left their balloon out in the open and it flew away. Now you're playing as the bear balloon and you're just trying to stay alive, avoiding different obstacles. That could actually work. Maybe that would be mechanic number 2 that I would build out if I could do that. These are just ideas that I'm getting right now that's happening in my head as I'm narrating this. That actually might work. I might consider it. I actually haven't gone back to an old character just yet. Possibly I would do it with character 3.1 so that I can create the bear balloon. I actually really like that idea. I want to see if it will work the way that I have it in my mind. I select these faces for the ears because I want to make them smaller. I feel like they're a little bit too large. Ears shouldn't be this big. So I'm scaling it in the y-axis. By pressing Y, this brings it a little bit closer. I'm also thinking about doing different formats of my videos. I feel like the way I've been doing it is a lot of thought process, devlogs, which is what I like. But I can also change many of these to a quick tutorial video if that's something that people like. So there's multiple ways to create your content. That's also on my mind right now. A lot of this is me just going through the videos, seeing what ideas I come up with, which is good. I should have this recorded and documented. There's also other ways to repurpose this video. That's what I'm thinking about right now, of possibly making a quick tutorial one. I mentioned that one earlier where people have it as create low poly model in 5 minutes. Like I can actually turn this character and the previous characters also into those type of videos. I'll probably do that when I get to that point after I start posting these devlog videos. There's just a lot of ideas that I have that I want to execute, and I'm trying to execute them all, but it's going to take me some time, and that's okay. We're about done with the bear head. I moved this to a new collection, character 3.1, rename it to head. That's a pretty good 3D model of character 3.1. The bear head, or the bear balloon, the low poly's on point. It's symmetric, very, very clean. It's taken me a few characters to get it to this point, but hey, progress is progress. It looks good because of the previous characters. Oh, actually, let's take a break. I'm at the point where we're adding the humanoid body, so I'll continue that on the next video. All right, so we're creating the humanoid body for character 3.1, the bear. It was supposed to be a bear balloon. I had that idea now, but the bear balloon is a variation that I didn't create yet. In this video, I've already did the humanoid body. That's what I'm going to be narrating for the rest of this video. Now we're creating the humanoid body. I add a plane, go into edit mode, select all the vertices, click collapse, and that collapses all the vertices into one vertex. I add a mirror modifier, a skin modifier, and a subdivision modifier. We get this nice circular polygon that we can manipulate to create the body. I change the viewport from 1 to 2. You get more subdivisions on your mesh. It becomes much more rounder if that's what you're looking for your character. We're going to use this to create the body like we did in the previous character 2.5 bug boots. This time we're going to be a little bit more precise and create some hands and some feet, but we got to create the body first. I'll scale this down. This is what I normally do. I like starting with a small circular mesh. This way it's easier. It's like creating a stick figure body. Go in X-ray mode if you want to see the vertices. You can always switch between the two. It's easier to see the mesh when you're not in X-ray mode. I forget what normal mode is. This view that I'm seeing, I should definitely know the terminology, but I'm still getting used to that. I'm just better at remembering techniques, movements, and workflows. Everything is using all the hotkeys. That's where I excel best at. I just remember things based on how I'm doing it visually and less about the terminology. Everyone's a little bit different. Also, I can always improve on my terminology by doing a Google search and reviewing what I talked about in the video. Also, if that's something you want to improve yourself on, I would definitely suggest possibly recording yourself and seeing things in your perspective, which allows you to improve on your terminology. Sometimes I don't know certain things within Blender. I know what I'm doing, but sometimes I have a hard time explaining it. Well, I actually record everything and talk about it. There are times when I'm supposed to be explaining something within Blender, but I actually don't know what they are, so I just refer to it as either toggles or that button. It's kind of self-explanatory based on what I'm showing on the screen, but I should probably get better at figuring out the actual terminology for some of these tabs and buttons and stuff in Blender. I just go with the flow. I'm a little bit more hands-on. Anyways, back to creating the body. With this circular mesh, I extruded to the right in the x-axis, and then I extruded down in the z-axis. You can press X, Y, and Z to constrain it to that axis, which makes it easier to do straight lines. This is going to be the legs. It looked like the arms starting off, but it's actually the legs. When you go into X-ray mode, you can see all the vertices. This is why it's good to switch between the two. From the middle vertice, I extrude up in the middle in the Z-axis. I press Z to constrain it to the Z-axis. Otherwise, you'll get a weird shape in the middle where we just want a straight body. From this middle vertex, which is supposed to be the middle of the body, I extrude up in the Z-axis is the chest area now. I tend to create vertices when I reach different parts of the body. That just makes sense to me because then I can actually scale it and create the shape later on. From the top vertex, I extrude up again. This is the neck. You can kind of visualize that based on how I did it. I drag this vertex down to the middle because that's where the stomach is going to be. Go to the skin modifier, mark your root right where the groin area is. I should look into what it actually does, but I just remember seeing it in videos where they marked the root around that area. So that's where I marked it. From this vertex where the chest is, I extrude on the x-axis. Remember, we have the mirror modifier on, so it's going to mirror the same thing on the opposite end. That's why I like Blender. I'm just doing about half the work to get the entire body. This is going to be the shoulder area where I stopped the vertex. and then extrude again to the right. This creates the forearm. So this is all visualization. Just think about it. When you're creating your character, where your joints are going to be. At least that's how I think about it. You can create a vertex on each of the joints that you think of. From this middle vertex, press Ctrl A. I'm able to scale the body up a little bit. This is like inflating your 3D mesh to give it the shape that it needs. But I undid that because I wanted to add more vertices in the middle. That way I could select these 3 vertices and scale all 3 of them to give myself more variety on seeing what each vertice will do when I scale them up. So if I select all 3 vertices and scale, how will that shape look like? And then also if I just select the vertice in the middle, what would that look like? With the vertices on the outside is actually constraining the shape in place. So I can have 2 endpoints that stop my shape. In the middle is looking a little bit more like a frisbee type shape now. It's not as round as I would like it, but that's because I added those extra vertices at the top and bottom. This is how you experiment with your body shape and see what you would like. This gives you a little bit more control during this time with this method. We'll just call it the body method because I have no terminology for this. This is the glitchy body method. This is the glitchy way. I'm gonna start coining that. Everything that I do is the glitchy way. Don't think my way is the correct way. It's not right. It's not wrong. It's just how I do things. It's glitchy thumbs. So this is the glitchy way. I undid that and removed the top and bottom vertice. I selected the middle vertice and also the one where the groin area is. I scaled that instead. This actually gives a pretty good looking body shape for the stomach area and the groin area. So far it's looking like he has some pants. If you're able to visualize that, if we texture paint down the middle, looks like some pants, similar to character 2.5, bug boots, where we're giving pants and some boots. I select the chest vertice now, scale that up, give it some shape. For Mr. Bear, that's just a name I just came off the top of my head, Mr. Bear. I don't have a final name for this character. If you do have some suggestions, you can also leave a comment and possibly I might use it as the name of this character. That's why I refer to a lot of my characters as character 3.1, 3.2, etc. Because I don't really have a finalized name for them just yet. I just have them labeled so I know this is what character is which. Eventually I'll get to that time when I'll name everything depending on what ideas I come up with and what game ideas come about this character. It's really going to come down to creativity and storytelling on how I bring this character to life within a game environment. That's all going to be based on a lot of factors, depending on what game mechanic I put them in, what other obstacles, whatever story I try to give it. That's going to help with the name towards the end. From this top vertex, I need to create a neck. Extrude another vertex up to the top. You see that creates our neck. We can scale this area down to make it skinnier if we need to by selecting these 2 vertices. I grab these 2 vertices where the leg is to bring it in just a little bit and see how that looks like. That looks okay, but we'll bring it back to the original position. Instead, I'll scale it up just to see what we're working with. Give him some more thicker legs, but does that look good? I don't know. We'll just have to see. I'm very experimental like this. I'll scale each vertice just to see what they do and what shape I can get out of it. And then I'll select multiple vertices around the same area of a specific body part and see what happens. Similar to what I'm doing here with a thigh. I have no reference for the body, so I kind of have to make it up on the spot. It's all what I imagine in my head. Bears have somewhat of a thicker body, but this can also be like a teddy bear. When I think about all of that, what does that body type look like? What I imagine is whatever you see on the screen of how the bear's body should look like. Everyone's going to think of different things. Like the way you imagine a bear body might be different than how I imagine it. That's also perfectly fine as well. We all have different ideas. We're all creative in our own ways. That's why this is all pretty cool, to be able to showcase how my thought process is. Maybe that'll help your thought process. This is just going to be helpful for myself and a lot of people, so that's why I tend to make these videos now. I grab this vertice in the middle. Normally you can just select it and move it up and down to get your topology to come out a little bit better. You can look at it where the topology isn't going to be really good when I actually apply these modifiers. I just move the vertices around just to get something that's a little bit more aligned and straightened out. It's a little bit tricky where the leg area is because of how the mesh is being created. So you have to be aware of that to make sure your UV unwrapping process later on is going to be easier for you. That's why I'm always observing and analyzing how this shape is turning out, really looking at the mesh and seeing how those lines look, because I know I'm going to need to mark the seams later on. I'd rather have something that's much more straightened out early on in the process than later on have to deal with that issue. A lot of this is going to be trial and error, like I said. Unless you prefer to have a reference to actually base it off of something, you can also Google some images of different bears. That might be useful for yourself to see how different characters look like as a bear, and then see what you like, mix and match, put it together in something like PureRef. That's just a program where you can drop all your ideas in PNG formats. You can have some sort of like mood board of a bunch of ideas for your character, and then you can base it off of that. If that's something easier for you to imagine, I'd like to just go with the flow and experiment based on how I imagine things in my head. Bears aren't that hard to think about in terms of how the humanoid body would be, at least how I imagine it to be. I imagine things quite a bit in my head. I can see how certain shapes would be before it even happens. That's how I normally do things for my characters. Also, I like just going with the flow and coming up with a random body type anyways. If you think about it, I can always reuse this body at any time for any of my future characters if the head matches, or even if I want to create a Frankenstein type character where the head doesn't even make sense on this type of body, I can actually do that. Also, you'll realize that a lot of the things that you do in Blender, you can actually reuse. So that's something I've been thinking about across all my characters. Like if I do create one body type, I wonder if I can just reuse it for multiple characters where I'm just creating a separate head, and then we can just swap the head out. And now we have a new character. But that's all dependent on how the body type looks like, whether it makes sense, and if it makes sense for the game mechanic that I come up with or the game idea. Then that's also on my mind. That's actually a good idea for you guys to start thinking about if you are creating your own 3D models. Thinking about how can you reuse this for future games. That just makes your life so much easier, so you don't have to repeatedly create 3D models all the time. The process is a little bit tedious, but if you enjoy it, then it really doesn't matter, because then you can record the process, post the creation. That actually helps build your brand, build your skill set. That's what I normally do. I'm creating all of this stuff because I'm actually practicing, I'm building my skill set, I'm showcasing what I can do with Blender, but I'm also still learning about the entire process. So that's why I try not to say that I'm an expert in this stuff. I'm still a student, I'm trying my best, I'm still a beginner. That's how I like to keep it, because I'll continually keep learning, because that's how life works. You're supposed to keep learning as you live your life. You never stop learning, otherwise what's the point? If you know everything, then there's no reason to exist, right? So I constantly like to learn various different things whenever I can. Of course, I'm not trying to burn myself out, but I also try to learn things that improve my quality of life and things that actually improve what I'm doing on my everyday life. I love creating characters. I like coming up with game ideas. I like coming up with ideas. So being able to add Blender and creating 3D models into my own skill set has actually been a key proponent of my growth, because that actually helps me create anything I want to use in my game ideas, which was something that I normally had to do by hiring artists and designers. Now I don't need to do that, because I can actually do it myself. That's something that's very different for me this year. I'm trying to push the boundaries on what I can do so that I can create some more cool things in a very different way than I normally have done it in the past. This actually changes a lot of things in terms of my direction of what I'm taking for a game dev journey of mine. So I'm glad that you guys get to see all of this happening as much as I can put out the content, but also I think it's pretty cool. I've always wanted to document the entire process, but I never knew how it would look like. Now I'm actually rewatching everything and seeing how this is all playing out. I'm actually excited that this has actually come into fruition. So I'm hoping to keep pushing the boundaries. Hope you guys are excited as much as I'm excited. Let's keep plowing through and getting to that next game idea. I think this is all pretty fun stuff, especially for me, and hopefully it is for all of you guys that are watching. Back to the feet. I extrude in the y-axis to create the ankle, and then I extrude again. This could also be part of the foot, but then I extrude again in the y-axis to constrain it, and I press Y to constrain it to the y-axis. Normally when I do this, it doesn't show the hotkey sometimes. If you see the green line show, that means I constrained it to the y-axis. If you see the red line show, that means I constrained it to the x-axis. If you see the blue line show, that means I constrained in the z-axis. So that's how you'll know it visually. At least that's how I remember it. Whenever I see that, that's what happens. Sometimes the hotkeys don't show, and that's how it's going to be sometimes. I'm trying to create the knuckles of the foot. Is it knuckles? I don't even know the terminology for that. You understand what I'm talking about. We're going to create some toes. This character is going to have 3 toes. This is how my vertices are set up. The vertices that's selected right now, we're going to use that to fix the mesh later. Don't worry about how the mesh is looking right now. It looks all messed up because that's normally what happens. When you actually extrude it out, it'll turn out just fine. I select these top vertices and extrude. It all depends on how you imagine it, on how your toes are going to be. So these are going to be the toes. I chose to have 3 toes for character 3.1, Mr. Bear. You can see they're all like scrunched up right now. Again, if you don't like how the setup is, you can always restart it. I think I undid that here and did it again. You can just select the separate vertices to separate them apart. Also be aware of how your mesh looks like where the foot is. You don't want your meshes to be all squished like this. That's why you have this middle vertex in the middle. You can experiment by moving your vertices around to get the mesh to come out correct. I deleted that vertex for the middle toe. Actually separates the shape from the original shape. That's actually interesting. I don't remember doing this. This actually looks pretty cool to have shapes from each other in this body method. That actually creates some unique feet. Or if you're looking at it right now, this can actually be antennas on a character's head. There's various ways to look at this, but we're working on the feet. I delete that top vertex. And I think having the middle toe was what was causing the mesh issues. The focus is to make sure the left and right toe looks correct first. This looks like some alien feet at the moment. Don't worry, it will look just fine towards the end. Trust me, creating your character, the entire process just looks like it's not going to work when you're making it, but the final product actually comes out pretty good. Extrude the vertex in the middle to create the middle toe. From the vertex of the foot, this is where you'll drag up and down or left and right to get the mesh to come out much more perfect. You can already see how the topology is going to look like based on the lines on your mesh. Be very cautious about that. I grab all these vertices to bring the toes much closer for the character. Now we have some big toes and a skinny ankle. But with these vertexes, we can actually scale them to get a size that we like. When you press Ctrl A and then press X to constrain it to the X-axis, you can scale it to see how that looks like. Constrain it to the Z-axis, constrain it to the y-axis and see how all those look like. You can also constrain it to specific axes like the x and y by pressing, I think it's Shift Z, and that will constrain it to those specific axes. The Shift Z is constraining to all the axes without Z. You can select all the vertices and scale it all at the same time if you want. It's entirely up to you how you want to do this process. It's all experimental for me. If you select all the vertices and scale it up, now you get some fat, puffy feet for this character. This could actually work if I kept it this way. It really depends how you want your feet to be like. Also, a good idea would be to create various different body types and then just save them for any future characters and just reuse certain things that you like. Possibly you like feet from a specific character. You can also save those meshes and then apply it to your next body as well. There's various ways to combine things in Blender. Just make sure all the vertices line up. That way you can create some sort of Frankenstein body of your character, like a chimera. That's something that I actually want to create one time, like a specific game where the head is different from the body, and then the arms will have some sort of wings instead of arms, or one of the feet can be like a fish fin and the other one is like a wooden leg or something. Just something crazy like that makes the game all wacky and wild. But that's just an idea. I just have a whole bunch of ideas sometimes. Sometimes I'm not even going to use it. It just happens. I'd like to save them in case I use them, but sometimes I don't. I'm scaling the feet to give it a little bit more skinny toes. I kind of like big feet like this. It just looks pretty cool for the character. This is all imagination as well, because I don't think bears have feet like this anyways. I mean, they do have feet, but it's more like having claws as well. Mine is like having some frog feet. I think frog feet look like this, but it's fine. It's okay. That's how I decided to have the feet for character 3.1. I like the size at the moment, even though it's unproportional to the body. We can always fix that anytime by scaling it down. Sometimes when I'm scaling with this body method, it changes the shape that I like, but I also just want it to be smaller. Like, I like the way it looks, but I just want it to be smaller. That's why I keep it super big like this and then scale it later on when I actually apply the modifiers. You have to make those decisions as you're working on different parts of the body. I kept the feet the same. Even though they're unproportional right now, we can always scale them down later when we apply the modifier. Now I'm working on the arms. I extrude from here to create the forearms, and then extrude again to create the wrists, and extrude 3 more times to create the knuckles. We have 3 toes, so we're obviously going to have 3 fingers. That's just what I decided for this character. Select the vertex in the middle of the hand, scale that up, and that gives you a more inflated hand, and the topology looks much better this way, along with the shape. Why did I delete the vertices for the feet? I have no idea why. The feet look perfectly fine the way it was. Not sure why I did that. I think I wanted it to look more like the hands, so I started over. It worked out with the hands, extruding it a certain way, so I did it again for the feet with the same amount of joints, and then scaled the foot again with the joint in the middle. This happens quite often for me. I do something and I was like, wow, that actually looks better than the other body part. So I like to just delete everything and restart again. I guess I didn't like the previous feet and decided to go with new feet. Again, the feet will be much better later on. I should actually use this hotkey more. I always accidentally press Z all the time. I think that's the hotkey. When you press Z, you can switch between solid mode, wireframe, rendered mode, and material preview mode by just moving the mouse in those directions. That's the way to switch between modes in Blender, by pressing a hotkey. I almost all the time accidentally press hotkeys. That's how I learn things in Blender as well. I'm like pressing things all the time because of different movements that I do when I'm working. I'm just learning a specific technique, and then I end up pressing the wrong key sometimes, but I actually learn new hotkeys that way. I don't know if that happens to other people. Maybe it does, but when I do that, I'm like, oh, interesting. Now I know how to do that. But then I never actually use it because I don't need to. I like to just select the toggles at the top. That's at least how I remember it because it's visual. Occasionally, I'll learn hotkeys because it's just so much faster by remembering the hotkeys and pressing that with your keyboard. I'm very visual, so I have to see things to actually get it to work. Remembering hotkeys for me is a little bit tricky sometimes unless I look at the keyboard. Sometimes if the keys are close to each other, then I don't have that issue at all. Now selecting the middle vertex, I'm scaling this to get some sort of rounder body for the bear. It's always good to give your characters some shape. And the arms felt a little bit too long, so I'm scaling that in. Also the neck as well. Shoulders, definitely need to scale this up a bit to give it a little bit more shape. Get a little bit small shoulders. Scale the body in the x-axis to give it a little bit more love handles on the side. I tend to go in X-ray mode a lot to look at the face to see if the face actually matches the body type. It definitely does. It looks pretty good. Feet are actually gigantic. I kind of remember why I kept it that way. Like I said, I wanted to scale it later on, but keep the size the way it is. But I like the shape of the foot. I just don't like the size of it. I think we're done with the body. I duplicate the collection, save the mirrored version of character 3.1. We actually might call it Bear Bear. Oh, I'm thinking about that because one of my nieces has a bear blanket that she really likes. That's why I'm thinking about that. Bear Bear. This character might just be Bear Bear. We don't know, actually. It all depends. What I'm doing here is applying the skin modifier on its own to see what happens if I do that. That doesn't really look good for the shape. You want to apply all the modifiers at once. I should look into what the difference is between apply to active object only or apply to all objects. I definitely don't know what that means. I'm guessing the active object is my body that I selected. Applying to all the objects applies to head as well. I don't know what I need to look into that, but I actually clicked apply to all objects. I mean, that worked. So that's what we're going to go with. I didn't have any issues. I select the feet. This is what I was talking about in terms of scaling the feet down to get a size that I like. I like the shape, but I don't like the size. This is the only way I thought about doing this. That was to scale it after I applied the modifiers. The middle toes are actually a little bit too close. In order to mirror half of the body, I need to be able to delete some of the toes. I'm deleting the chest area by selecting those vertices. If you're not in X-ray mode, you select the vertices only in the front. That's why when you delete it, you can still see the vertices in the back. If you're trying to delete half of the shape, definitely go into X-ray mode. Otherwise, you have to do this manually like I do. A faster way to do this in order to keep the left side of the foot correct is to select one of the faces on the right foot and then press Ctrl L, and it will select all the faces that are connected to that face. And that's a fast way to do it. Once you delete all those faces, now you have only the left side of the character or the right side, depending on how you're looking at the screen or your perspective. The scale down the feet and just drag it into place. Don't worry about it not looking good at all. You can always adjust your vertices to match. You might be able to come up with some cool ideas when you move things around. Like now, the leg looks like he has some pants with cuffs on. That's actually a unique part of the character now that I did that. Otherwise, it would have been straightened out. Hopefully, I kept that, which I don't remember. You can always adjust everything one by one. Now, the foot is proportional for the character. It definitely looks so much better this way. That's why I liked the shape of it. I just didn't know how to keep the shape but decrease the size, and this is the way to do it. Now that we have the correct foot on the body, we can add the mirror modifier again and mirror to the other side. This is the body shape for character 3.1, Bear. Now we have the head and the body. You can see how the character is coming about. It looks pretty good so far. You can actually imagine the character. Everything looks really good, like the topology on the head. Things are going to come out correct with texturing. Also, the body type, it's not all over the place. They definitely suit each other very well, the head and the body. Now we need to create the nose. I add a cube, add a subdivision surface modifier, scale that down, just align it towards the middle. If you want more of a rounder shape, just change the viewport from 1 to 2, gives you this nice rounder shape. You can always add more loop cuts, and that gives you more subdivisions. And then you can drag these vertices to better match the reference to get the nose similar to the sketch that I did. This is the way I decided to do the nose. You don't need the other half of the vertice because it's going to be connected to the face anyways. That finishes the nose. Now we need some eyes. I guess I decided to use a cube and the subdivision surface modifier again. This is different from the UV sphere that I normally use. The only reason why I started using the subdivision surface modifier with the cube was probably because I wanted to try something different than my normal method of creating the character. I'm always experimenting different ways to do things so that I'm continually teaching myself. Within Blender, there's multiple ways to do things. You really have to experiment to know what each method does, whether it's going to be beneficial for your next character or not. That's what I think about. And I add a loop cut. I try to get a rounded cube shape first before I start aligning the vertices into place so that we can create a more rounded shape. That way it's like molding the shape into how we want it. We just have to adjust things based on the meshes around us. This is how I decided to do the eyes this time. You can determine what you think was best. Was it using the cube with the subdivision surface modifier, or was it the UV sphere way? Both are very different. The topology on this way is very different from the UV sphere. It doesn't have the circular faces, so you gotta think about that in terms of texture painting as well. You can see the differences later on when we texture paint. I actually like the cube with the subdivision surface modifier. I feel like that always gives you a more rounder shape. We don't need these faces in the back. We only need the front part of the eye. If you go to a side view and you see some of your vertices sticking out, you can always adjust them. Since this character is very symmetric, you can just mirror it to the right side to get the other half of the eye, and then use that eye dropping tool and select the head, and it will mirror the eye based on the origin of the head. I move the eyes to the character 3.1 collection, look around the character to see, is this the final shape that we like? It looks pretty good. You can also press X-ray mode to always shift between the sketch in your 3D mesh. This prepares me for texture paint to see if I got all the 3D models that I need in separate objects. Things look so much better in 3D when you have separate objects as shapes. You can always texture things if you want on top of your mesh, but you gotta remember that things will stretch when you animate, depending on how you rig your characters. It all depends on how you want to do it. This is how I decided to make character 3.1 Bear. We're probably just going to texture the mouth in. I could also make a separate object for that, but that's not really needed. We're actually going to create eye set number 2. Now we get to compare between the two. I actually used the UV sphere. Good thing I did that because I talked about it to see what's the difference between the two. I add the UV sphere. This is much more rounder than our eye set number 1. I add that into place. You can see it doesn't really match the reference as much. We can always scale it to fit the shape, but it doesn't really fit. I also decided to add a subdivision surface modifier over the UV sphere, but we probably didn't need that. I'm probably experimenting to see how that even looks. It doesn't really fit this character, so you have to make that decision yourself. I deleted that, add a cube again, create another set of eyes, add a subdivision surface modifier, change the viewport to 2, scale that up. This looks exactly like eye number 1. I'm not sure why I'm doing it over again. Possibly because I didn't do loop cuts this time. I just kept the shape a little bit round like this, just so that we get more of a circular eye. I think eye number 1 was a little bit more squarish. I think that's what I was thinking about during this time. I'm rotating the eye to match the shape. It's not going to be straight looking at us, but more so on the side. Delete half of the mesh, the part that's going into the face, because we're not going to be able to see that anyways. Mirror it to the other side using the eyedrop tool and selecting the head. This is a little bit more rounder for the eyes. Go to a side view. The body isn't aligned with the head, so I move the body back. Always X-ray between the sketch and your 3D model. If things are unaligned, just move them over. Try to keep everything organized as best as I can during this period. I think I decided to go with eye number 2 for this. I didn't even realize I had 2 eyes, actually. I remember the character. It's just hard to remember the in-between. I can only remember the final piece, but the workflow and the methods and the things that I did to get to the final piece, it's all a little blur to me. If you're watching my videos, you can definitely tell a lot goes into creating your characters. That's what I mean by it's really hard to remember everything if you don't record everything. It's just good to record it because now you're refreshing your memory on how you did things. You can always use it in the future for future characters. That finishes off the blocking out portion for character 3.1 Bear. That actually took a very long time. This is actually a very long segment for blocking out. I'm gonna have to do a lot of editing for this, but I'm really glad to be able to narrate this part. Getting to this character is actually a pretty good milestone in terms of how the character design looks like for the 3D model. This is definitely much more symmetric than my previous characters. Everything looks much more smooth, aligned, like an actual good character. We're getting to that point in my Blender journey where my characters are starting to look less abstract and more like characters. Really glad to have this on video. Now everything else is going to be a little bit easier to narrate because we have UV Unwrap texture paint rigging with Mixamo, and then the animations are also in Mixamo. All of this, even though it has taken a lot of time, all the other stuff is going to be much more streamlined because now we have the humanoid body and we can use Mixamo to animate, similar to what we did for character 2.5 Bug Boots. Definitely stay tuned. I know this was a long video already, but we have so much more to cover. Let's get to the UV Unwrap portion. Before we unwrap our character, you have to make the decision on whether you want to apply your mirror or not, because that has an effect on how you unwrap your UVs. Sometimes it's just easier to unwrap half of your shape. So definitely keep your mirror on in that case. Sometimes you might want to unwrap it separately. Maybe you're texturing the mesh differently on the separate faces. That all depends on you. You have to make that decision as you're going into UV Unwrap. I duplicated the body to keep the mirrored version and drag that to my backup folder. Decided to apply the mirror to the body. But for the eyes, I kept the mirror modifier. That way I only have to do half of the eyes for the UV unwrap portion. Click UV editing. It'll split your screen into two, where the texture and the UVs are going to be on the left, and then your 3D model is going to be on the right side. So it's easier to select one side and then see what's happening on your UVs. On the left, add a new texture, character 3.1 texture. For each of your separate objects, you need to add a material. Since this is a new file, we don't have our previous materials. I could append it from a previous Blender project. It's good to set this up for your first character anyways, for good practice. I add a new material. I use the same material across the separate objects because they're going to be sharing the same image texture. The 3D model is still white at the moment. I didn't add the image texture just yet, so it's not applying the texture on our mesh. I probably do that later. Right now I'm just focused on selecting the different edges so that we can mark these seams for our UVs. This is where I'm experimenting on where I'm going to be cutting the shape, because I know this half going to be like the pants. I mark those seams, but it wasn't showing on the left side for some reason. I think that was what was bothering me at the time. Normally when I do this, I can see the UVs, but we don't have UV sync selection on, I don't think. When you actually unwrap the body, you actually have to manually press unwrap first to see the UVs. They actually don't show when you're marking seams. That's why I'm switching between the different views. I don't know why I switched to my pixel texture view. This was a different view that I was using for a different character. I was probably trying to troubleshoot this. I figured it out. If you press U and unwrap, then your UVs show. Since this is a new Blender project, I didn't have live unwrap set up just yet. So every time you start a new Blender project, just remember that you're going to need to check live unwrap on both sides, the left side and the right side. And then you can actually see all the seams that you mark and the changes that it makes to your UVs. This view is probably unnecessary because then the top left side is being unused and that's taking up screen real estate. Try to utilize as much screen space as possible to get the most use of what I'm doing on the left and the right side during each process. The UVs definitely need its own space on the screen. Selecting the 3D models and marking seams should have its own space. That's what I think about for the UV editing portion. That's how the thought process should be, at least for me it is. If you expand the unwrap menu down below, you can increase the margins. This is like the spacing between your UV islands, which you can see happening on the left side. This keeps your UVs separate from each other. When you're actually texture painting, the textures are going to bleed on each other. You don't want that if specific body parts are going to be specific colors. This is entirely up to you how you want to do this. You might want to have everything super close so you can save texture space. Just be aware that your textures might bleed into each other if you do it this way. A lot of this is actually pretty good to know while you're creating your characters. I actually don't use a lot of the margin, which I should. I just got reminded of it just now looking at this. I really don't use the margin too much. I should though, because a lot of my textures actually do bleed into different parts of my characters. It was good that I'm reviewing this and seeing it. I definitely skipped past this portion a lot because of all the things that I'm trying to learn and improve my own process to try to make everything so much faster. On the right side, if you click options, this is where you turn on live unwrap. I do for both sides for UV unwrap. I don't know what it does for the right side when you turn it on. I don't really see much happening on the right side. I see the live unwrap happening on the left side, but that's because I turned it on the left side. If you know what's the difference, you can leave that in the comments. This is how I decided to mark the seams for the body. There's a seam around the armpit area and then around the legs to create some sort of pants, kind of like a jumpsuit-ish or an overall type cut. This is all going to be based on your imagination, how you decide to mark your seams for your UVs. You might want a t-shirt, and how a t-shirt looks like is entirely up to you on how you cut it. Like to me, a t-shirt would be short sleeves, so you have to cut around the arm area and then cut around the waist area. This is like a jumpsuit-ish cut. If I were to texture paint this, it's easier to select very long edge loops by selecting one of the edges and then holding down Control and selecting the furthest edge in your path of the edge loop. This will select the shortest path between the two endpoints that you selected. That's why you see the middle edge was also selected. That's a fast way to do this. You just right click and mark the seam, and it shows in this red orangish color. When you press Control and select one of the edges, and then Shift Alt select the edge next to it. For this circular edge, it will select the entire edge loop. You can mark that entire seam much quicker than individually selecting each edge. That's the faster way to do it. I normally just remember where my fingers are. I'm pressing it so fast that I'm actually not thinking about it as much. That's why hotkeys are super important for various things in Blender. Otherwise, you're gonna have to do the tedious work of pressing it one by one, which isn't gonna be very efficient in terms of your time. That's why you should learn the hotkeys that you really need. This is what I mean by having the mirror modifier. It helps you do less of the work for marking seams and UV unwrap as well, but I don't have the mirror modifier on right now. So I have to mark the seams individually for both sides. Even though both sides are symmetric, I should have kept the mirror modifier on for the body. So that way I only had to mark half of the seams for the 3D model. It'll also be applied to the left side. Everything will also be stacked on top of each other as well, and we won't have to deal with that. During this time, I wanted to do individually, just more so for practice purposes. That's normally what I do for the tedious type of work. You don't want to skip things if you need the practice, because that's actually helping you get better in the long run, doing it the hard way, instead of trying to skip past it by taking the shortcut. If you've been taking the shortcut to everything, then when it gets to a point where you don't know certain things, then you're really going to struggle because you didn't go through the hard part just yet. I like to learn the hard part first before I start doing the easy part and taking shortcuts. It just makes more sense to me, even though it takes a little bit more time, but that time actually helps you build your skill set up for the long run. That's why I'm able to do a lot of this stuff without having any issues. I actually did all the hard work in the beginning. I just like getting that experience for myself. It helps you build discipline doing the hard work because you're actually working hard, and then you can actually implement working smart as well. I like to do both. I like to work hard and work smart, but you can't work smart without working hard first. You can't have one or the other. You gotta have both. That's what I think about. Marking the seams is gonna be very tricky in the beginning when you're starting out with your characters, especially for the body. If everything is connected like this, you have to really think like, where's the best place to mark the seams? You know, the textures are gonna be applied on the character, and you don't want connecting areas to really show within your games. That's why a lot of the seams are going to be marked in areas where it's not really visible to the player in your game. At least that's how I think about it. Like under the arms, because you know the arms are going to be to the side anyways. We're going to see more of the outer portion of the arms. So that's where I decided to do my cuts. You're not really going to see the side of the character. Mainly going to see either the back or the front. That's why the cuts shouldn't have been in the middle. I think that's why I don't have the mirror modifier on. If you do half of the body shape, the cut is actually going to be in the middle as well. But you can also experiment to see how everything looks like anyways. There's really no right or wrong answer. You can always cut it a certain way, and if it works for you, it works. Later on, when you try in your game engine of choice, you might be able to see the reason why specific seams don't work, and you can always adjust that. There's just really no right or wrong way to do it. I just like having different seams for different reasons. Sometimes you want to have different colors for a specific part of the body. That's why you want to separate that UV from other UVs, because it's easier to select specific UVs. If you already have it marked like this, you can just press Ctrl L to select all the faces for that UV. That's just easier for texture painting later on. That's why you have to go through the tedious work of doing this. That's the really importance I find for marking your seams and separating each UV. You can always do it the simplest way and just cut everything in half, but I like to experiment different ways to separate the UVs so that later on texture painting becomes so much easier for me. I don't have to worry too much about it. Since we have our margins a little bit higher, the UVs are actually separated for us in this way so that the islands aren't overlapping each other. So we have no issues of texture painting later where the textures won't bleed into each other. But if we kept it this way, this is actually not utilizing as much space on the texture. This is just one body part, and we need to unwrap the head and the eye as well. Also consider that you have other textures in your game, such as ones for environments, for enemies, such like that. All of that is increasing your file size for your games. The more textures you have, the more 3D models is all going to increase the game size. All the mobile devices can handle large files now. It's not really an issue, but that's what I think about in terms of my games as well. You don't want to have unnecessary textures and files in your game if you're not really using it. You want to make sure everything is concise and jam-packed to keep your file size down. That would increase your chances of a player playing the game as well. Your game doesn't take as long to load a lot of different things. This is how I decided to cut the UVs for the body. I turn on snapping mode for vertex. This way we can start stacking our similar shapes. This is what you have to do to utilize as much of the space in your texture. That mesh is going to be sharing the same color anyways. So it's definitely important to stack them on top of each other so that they can utilize a specific location in the texture space. If the mesh doesn't look correct, sometimes you just need to mirror them like I do here. I forget what this add-on is called. I should actually look into it. Probably be useful to mention the add-on's name for you guys to use. I'll look into it. I just forget sometimes when I add a bunch of add-ons and I don't really write the names down. I just use the functionality that's available to me to make my life easier. With this add-on, you can mirror your UVs, rotate them, do all sorts of things, and it's just easier to click a button than to manually move it around. If you have UV sync selection on, you can select specific edges or vertices or faces to see where it's at on the right side. That's how you know which UV this is. You can kind of tell how it looks like because of the way you cut it. This would be the top part of the shirt of the body. This helps with organizing your UV because then you'll know what each UV is for. That's going to help you with texture paint later on. The one I'm grabbing here is the pants. I'm organizing it where I can visually see what this UV is. Right now, the shirt's on the top and the pants are at the bottom. If I wanted to draw something on top of the texture in that location, then I would be able to draw some sort of like graphic on top of the shirt. For these, I think it might be the foot. That's what it looks like to me. There's 4 of them because there's a top part and a bottom part. The shape is very similar, so you can just stack all 4 of them on top of each other. Again, if you don't know what it is, you can have UV sync selection on, select all the vertices, and it'll highlight on both sides. And I guess that explains what Live Unwrap does for both sides. If you have it checked on the right side, it will highlight that UV on the 3D model. And if you have it checked on the left side, they'll highlight the flat UVs on the left side. Actually, that's because UV sync selection is on. I don't know what I'm talking about. I'm just trying to explain what's going on here as best as I can. So I remember a lot of the stuff that I did for each character. Every character is going to be different. I do various different things to create different characters. And it's impossible to remember all of it unless I actually explain it, so that I can actually watch it and review it at some point. But even then, I'm still working on new characters, so I might even learn new things to create them. I'm always going to be learning something. It's just best to do that with all the characters. That area was the arm. That arm looks different than the other arm for some reason at the bottom. The problem with having UV sync selection on is you can't just select one island with a click of a button. You have to highlight it because there's only vertex, edge, and face selection when you have UV sync selection on. When you turn it off, there's a 4th option, which is island selection, which selects the entire island. That makes it easier, where you don't have to highlight everything. You just click it with a click of a button. That's why you see me switching between UV sync selection all the time. I'd rather not highlight things. I'd rather just click something and it selects the entire island. That makes stacking the UV so much easier. I don't know what that part looks like, actually. Let's see. So this part is the top of the foot. I guess this is the top of the foot. So the other thing we stacked was the paws, I guess, or the top of the paws, or the hands, I mean. Paws, same thing. I guess this is the top of the foot, the way I separated it. Some shapes just look way too similar for me to think about. It's just easier to compare it to the right side sometimes by selecting it. I think this is the bottom of the feet. I'm just organizing it after I stack them. This would be the front of the toes. Again, you don't have to make as much cuts as I am doing. I just do it for practice, just so I keep familiarizing myself with the UV unwrap process and seeing what my brain does to try to make this much more efficient than the last time I did this. It's actually just making it more complicated because I'm seeing all these different ways to cut my shape. I want to create different clothes for my character. I do that with texturing quite a bit. That's why I'm cutting it in various ways now. This is why I don't like having UV sync selection on. If you're zoomed in sometimes and you move it around and you notice some of the UVs on the other islands are stretched for some reason, that's because UV sync selection was on and you were moving around some vertices that were connected to those islands. That's the issue on having UV sync selection on sometimes when you're stacking things. That's why I have to turn it off. I think I pressed undo. You can always press undo to get back to that point, but I just didn't know when it happened. Just turn it off and then restack it again, and you don't have that issue. Those are things that I learned along the way. Hopefully that helps you guys out. This is going to be a very long video, but I like having in-depth videos like this to really dig deep into what I did exactly for my different characters. Sometimes people skip a lot of the processes and just try to have a quick tutorial. But there are things that you learn throughout the entire process that are definitely super helpful as you're going through it. That's why I like making videos like this. I actually run into a lot of problems as I go and then I solve them along the way. But it's good to be able to have it in video form because everyone else is also going to go through this. I just like having the thought process around it when you get to that point. Like, what do you actually do when you run into this problem? And I run into a lot. That's how I decided to do my videos. I just think it's just better to have very, very long form content like this. I like this content. Pretty sure a lot of people out there like it as well. Being able to see everything from the beginning to the end without taking any shortcuts, doing it the hard way. I think that's all very important to the entire thing. Also, I'd like to hear like feedback about this on the way I'm doing it. Not many people like long videos like I do. Maybe they do want just like a short tutorial, but I also need that feedback to know, okay, maybe I should also make content like that too. So I'm actually hitting 2 different audiences, and that would actually help my channel out to cater to different types of people as well. But I just need to put something out there first to know what people like. This is the content that I'm deciding to go with. We can see what people think about it at the end of the day. Either way, I like it. I enjoy it. I enjoy my own content actually because I can learn a whole bunch again if I review it from the beginning. Just making sure to cut out all the dead space, not really wasting people's time. That's what I've been doing with a lot of my characters. Just explaining as best as I can certain things that I think are super important. But also I do go off on a tangent sometimes like I'm doing now. This is all ideas that I have and thoughts that happen when I'm actually recording the entire process. And I think this is also important too, to include this. So yeah, that's why I do it. There's like various different things that are happening, but I can chop up all these things into different pieces of content and post them on various platforms and see what really resonates with a lot of people. Everyone's going to go through this process. If you're creating characters with Blender, you're going to need to know all the pitfalls and how to solve them. Also, what are you going to do with the characters now? That's where my content comes in. I use build blocks. I try to make a game out of it. It has its limitations, but it still works for me. I know a lot of people use Unity. I'm not very good with Unity. It's still technical for me, so I don't dabble too much into that space. But there's also like other people who are much more familiar with the Unity process than I am. There's just so many different people you can learn from, and it's just good to see how everyone thinks, their own workflow, their own thought process, and this one's mine. I'm happy to share the beginning portion of creating my characters because I think it's going to be super helpful. It's been super helpful for me because now I get to actually create all the content that I want. I've always wanted to make content daily. I just didn't know of what just yet. Now I have all these sketches of my characters that I want to make, and that actually became the content. We're going to create as much characters as possible and just showcase all the characters by putting out as much content as possible. That's my thought process, and that's why I'm doing all this. Plus, it's fun. It's fun to do. It's a good practice for me. We finish unwrapping the body and we're moving on to the head. I duplicate the head to keep the mirrored version, but I don't know why I deleted that. I normally just drop it into my backup folder. Weird. I don't know why I did that. We'll just see why I did that. For the head, I just marked the seam down the middle. Super easy. Now I duplicated the head to keep a mirrored backup. I actually marked the seams first. I think the thought process was I wanted to unwrap the 3D model first so that it has the UVs, and then you create a backup of it. Otherwise, I'll only have a backup of the 3D model without the UVs. That's why I did that. If I delete the head and start over and I use the backup version, I still have to unwrap again. That just makes my life harder. Since we unwrapped the head already with the mirror on, we only had to mark the seams down the middle for half the object. Now, if I apply the mirror modifier, the seam is selected around the entire head, but you can see our UVs are still just half of the shape. So what you would do is just press U to unwrap again. Now you have the correct UVs on the left side. That was a specific method that you need to remember if you want to make your life easier. I think that's why I did it separate for the body, so that you guys can understand what's going on when I don't have the mirror modifier on, where you have to do everything individually. In comparison, I did the head with the mirror modifier on, and it made the process a little bit faster because I didn't have to mark all the seams. I just needed to unwrap the UVs again. But with both processes, you still have to stack them on top of each other. But either way, it depends on how you want to do it. If you end up making custom seams anyways, it's probably better to apply your mirror modifier so you can have the actual shape. And I'm marking the seams for the front part of the bear's head because we're going to draw the mouth on that UV. I need to mark the seams for the back as well. I actually could have just kept it along with the other parts, but the back is going to be separate from the front, so that's why we're not going to stack them. With this circular shape, which consists of the ears and around the face, you can keep it like this for your UVs, where it's like a ring shape. That's entirely up to you. Or you can select the seams down the bottom of the head, and this splits the UVs from those edges, creating a more rectangular shape. This is all dependent on you. Sometimes you want to organize your UVs a certain way. Rectangular shape saves up more room than the ring shape does. You would have to cut it in a certain way. So I'm experimenting, clearing seams to see if we can save some space. This is the usefulness of live unwrap, because you can see what's happening as you mark seams and clear seams. So I can split the ears if I need to from around the head. That way I can have different colors for the ears separate from the rest of the head. This is how I decided to mark the seams for the head. The ears have its own separate islands that we can stack. And then around the side of the face has its own islands. The front of the face has its own island, and the back has its own island. This keeps everything organized for texture painting later. For the eyes, I'm selecting this middle area so we can draw the pupil on top of it. This is more of a square shape than our normal UV sphere, which is circular. You'll see how this is pretty useful for putting the pupil on top of it later in the texture paint portion. Around the eye, I decided to mark the seam down at the bottom. This way we get a long island that's curved like this, but we can actually rectify it and make it rectangular. I don't think I figured that out yet, but that button's right there next to straight. I was trying to straighten this out. That saves space on the texture. Or you can select the faces and right click and press follow quads. That would do the same thing, but I think I didn't figure that out yet in this video. I was trying to figure out how to do it by pinning one of the islands and then pressing the straight button, but I think straight doesn't really solve that problem. It's just giving us a circular UV. The way I'm doing it here is I'm selecting the middle edge loop, pressing Shift W and selecting straighten, but it's actually not straightening out. I press Align Auto and it gives us a straight line. That's not how I wanted it. I think Shift W only works for vertices, possibly, or works best when you use it for vertices. This time I align on the X-axis. That straightens out the left edge loop. I just drag that out. I do the same for the middle vertices by pressing Align Auto. Do the same for the right edge loop. This is how you would manually do it to create a rectangular shape. This rectangular shape actually fits better in the texture space versus that curved shape. It's just better for organizing, but the edges are still underlined. Doing this way is a little bit tedious. You have to manually do it for each edge. I think during this time, I didn't know the process to do it, so I had to manually do it. I was just experimenting to see how I can actually do this much faster. But I was selecting each edge and then scaling it in the Y-axis or the X-axis, and then pressing 0 so it would be straightened out. It's going to be the same thing when you texture paint that location for the UV. It's still going to apply the color on top, similar to how it looks on the mesh on the right. So the UVs can be a very different shape from your mesh. It's all dependent on you, on how you decide to unwrap your character. This is how I did it to save space on my textures. We're finished with the eyes. I just need to do it also for the nose. The nose can be simple. It can just be the edge loop around the end. Doesn't have to be super detailed if you don't want. I just kept it that way. The nose can be one color. In object mode, select all of your objects, go into edit mode so you can actually organize all your UVs into place. Probably it's best to separate individually in a different location first. In object mode, select the eyes, move it out the way. Select the head, move it out the way. Select the nose, move it out of the way. In object mode, it's probably better to select each separate object on its own and then move the UVs in a different location first. That way it's not overlapping each other. Select all your objects in object mode and go into edit mode. And you can organize each UV set now because they're not overlapping. That's how I normally do it. I have everything out of the way and set up the UVs all together later on. This keeps everything organized. You know which set is which, if you remember, by recording your process or just clicking into different parts of your character with UV sync selection on. We're finished with UV Unwrap for character 3.1, Bear. This is actually a long video, so I do apologize, but I really think this is going to be a very powerful video in my character development journey, Blender journey, or game development journey, all three, all at once. That's why I'm being super thorough about this process. I think this video is going to help a lot of people. Also, I'm going to be able to chop up different parts of this into short form content. That's also going to help spread the different things that I learned in this video. So yeah, I will continue texture paint in the next video. All right, let's get to texture painting character 3.1, which we're calling Bear. I'll start with the head first by selecting it. Go to edit mode if you want to select specific faces, but if you want to texture paint the entire thing, just go to texture paint from here. You can see the mesh is pink right now. That's because there's either no material on the mesh or the material doesn't have our image texture, so we're unable to texture paint on it. How to resolve this is by clicking this yellow button next to base color, and then you can add the image texture from here, and then select this image icon and select the texture we made, character 3_1_texture. When you bring down the viewport shading menu, go to flat. I don't do it on the right side. You can if you want to. I bring down the menu on the viewport shading on the top left, change that from studio to flat, material to texture. The mesh on the left side shows our texture. This is how I decided to do it. That way I can keep the shape gray on the right side. That's going to help me select the different faces correctly. I just like having different views for different purposes. Just makes it easier for me. I guess this tricks my brain into simultaneously doing multiple things. That way, this entire process isn't as boring because I'm constantly having to switch my view from many of the different views. I think that's why I really like Blender actually. There's just like multiple things happening, firing off in my brain when I do it. Before we can actually texture paint, make sure to check the normals by checking face orientation. We know the head's going to be incorrect because we used a plane to make it, so it's always going to be red, while everything else was a default polygon provided by Blender. I go to mesh, normals, flip. There we go. We flipped the normals for the head. Everything is blue, which is correct. Now we can turn off the face orientation and get to texture paint. I go to texture paint. You see the color changes on the right side as well. That's how you know everything is working correctly. Now we just need to fill in the colors based on our grayscale colors. But this is a new Blender file. It doesn't have our previous color palettes. So we have to create a new one, or you can append a color palette from your previous Blender projects. I don't know if I do it in this video for that process. Most likely I didn't, but it's gonna be in one of the future videos. So possibly the next character set would be where I append it, I think. But if that's not the case, I'll probably do a video early on if that's requested in the comments. If not, we'll just keep doing it this way. I'm adding this white color first because I normally use white for like the eyes or something. I'm also adding black. Those are the typical colors I use for the hard colors. And then we need a main color, which is going to be some sort of light gray. So I add that. And then I need some shading for the character. So it's going to be a darker gray, like a charcoal color. If I need another darker color, then I get a more darker charcoal. There we go. Those are the simple grayscale colors I use to fill in my characters at the moment. I like to focus on getting the 3D model finish first before I actually think about actual colors and color palettes. I save that towards the end. Every character can pretty much be any color. It just really depends on the situation, what type of game mechanics you plan to put it in, what type of environment it would look best in, what color palette, what type of vibe you want to give off for your game. There's a lot of factors that go into it. During this process, I haven't even thought about that at all. I drew the concept art, which was a sketch, and I want to make the 3D model in Blender and then use that 3D model inside of BuildBox to build some sort of game mechanic around the character. That's as far as I've thought about for this character and all the previous characters that we worked on. There's really no color scheme just yet for me. That's just how my thought process is until I've gotten to the end of building a game mechanic, and then I see, okay, this is what I want for this character in this type of game mechanic, this type of environment, these enemies around it. Now I start including color after that. It just makes more sense to me that possibly, let's just say in the game mechanic, I'm using this bear in some sort of nature around trees. So the bear could possibly be just like a normal brown bear, right? Maybe it's messing around with some beehives around it. The beehives, when I think of beehives, are like yellow. So that's how my brain thinks about the character development process within the game development process. A lot of things can actually change. I talked about nature. So nature is going to be green. You have green nature, yellow beehives, brown bear. That's one scenario that possibly might happen for this character. There could be another scenery that happens where this bear is in a toy store. This bear is actually a teddy bear, possibly with a white coat. That changes the entire thing on how you think about it in terms of, okay, this bear has a white coat as a teddy bear. So what's around it? It can be colorful toys, right? Colorful toys. That makes the entire environment stand out way more than the bear itself. But the bear has the focus because of the white color. That's how I think about this entire thing. Those are two different scenarios. Those are actually two different ideas that I can actually make now based off of this character now that I have this video. That's how the idea creations happen for me. I need to go through the entire process hands-on first, learn all that, create it, and then give myself the ability to use the 3D model inside of a game mechanic, inside of BuildBox, and then we can start creating and using colors. That's how I think about it. Hopefully that helped. That was a pretty good example, at least for me. I'm glad I'm recording this because now I have two different scenarios possibly for this character and I haven't built the game mechanic yet. Anyways, back to texture paint. I press the fill tool. Every time you switch between the tools, the color always resets to the first color in your color palette, which is an interesting thing. When I select the fill on the head, is actually filling it in with white. This always happens to me. I always forget to select the color that I actually want, which is the gray. It should have been the gray, but it was only gray when we had the selection on the text draw tool. That always happens. I always get confused. Don't be alarmed if your color's off. That's the reason why. I have to select the gray color now and select the mesh again, go out of texture paint mode, and then go back to object mode to select the body. This is how you have to do it if you want to paint across different objects in Blender. If you have separate objects, you always have to switch between object mode, edit mode, and texture paint. That's the process for the texture paint portion. Keep that in mind when you're doing this. I haven't found a much faster process just yet. I think this process is okay to fill it in. It's a little bit tedious, but it works for filling in colors. I'm still trying to figure out a way to possibly do it on my Apple Pencil. I do have this lunar display that makes your iPad like a sidecar, but then you can use Blender on your iPad. I could probably show that in some future video whenever I get to it. Fill in the body with the gray color. I actually unwrapped this character with clothes because you can see how I marked the seams. I probably was going to give it a shirt and some pants but I don't think I did so towards the end. At least I don't remember it. We select the nose, go to texture paint, and fill this in with the middle gray color. That separates the nose from the head and the body to give us that clear contrast of gray colors. This is just giving me early ideas for character 3.1, Bear. I select the eyes, go to texture paint, fill it in with whites, back into edit mode, select these middle faces for the eyes. This is a different process for the pupils this time, because for the eyes, I used a different method to make them. I used a cube and a subdivision surface modifier. So the mesh is actually different around the eyes. We normally use a UV sphere and there's circular faces that you select, but this one has square faces. You can actually compare between these two eyes that I've done just to see which one you prefer best. This is why I do these things, so that there's alternatives to creating different 3D models. There's always going to be many ways to create something. You just have to find the best method that works for you. For me, I like finding various different ways to create one thing just to see which one is much more efficient, which one produces the best results, which one actually challenges me to learn more, be able to create the final character that I like. Those are a lot of things that I think about when I'm creating all these characters. And it just really depends on you. You can just stick to one method if that works for you, or you can just find all the best methods, figure out for yourself which one you like the best, and then choose that method that you think will help you create as much characters as you want. At least that's my goal. So I need to find the most efficient way to do that. So I got to do all the methods if I can with each character and see which one produces the best results. I select the text draw tool with the black color, go into X-ray mode so I can see my sketch. He looks like he has pretty big pupils. Go into front view just so we can get the eyes perfect. I'm pressing F to lower the brush size. That's a quick hotkey that's useful in texture paint, and I just paint the pupil. I'm constantly looking, and simultaneously I'm looking at the left side to see how the pupil would look like on the character, as if the character is super small. It looks different when you have it zoomed in on the right side versus looking at the character zoomed out. Most likely in your game, it's going to look more like the top left. You have to really look at everything from different perspectives to make sure this is the final look that you want for your character. I really don't like the soft brush for some reason. Rather just have a hard brush. You can change this by scrolling at the top. First, I go to options. There's a bleed option. I change this from 2 pixels to 3 pixels. This helps the color bleed more on your texture, which is going to show on the bottom left. This helps with making sure the edges don't have a black texture around it where we cut our UVs. Majority of our texture is black and we filled gray on top of it. So the bleed really helps that. Otherwise, where we mark the seams will have a black color because of the texture. Since I already filled in the color with the bleed of 2 pixels, I have to redo this for all the objects again. I selected the eyes, texture paint, filled it in with white again. You can see it on the bottom left around the whites, fills in a little bit more of the pixels because we added 1 more pixel size to the bleed. I select the head, texture paint, select the gray color, fill it in again. You can see it slightly on the bottom left. I should have had this part zoomed in for you guys to actually see what's going on, but you can kind of see it. Hopefully that makes sense what the bleed does. I normally do this for my characters. It just helps with applying the textures on top of your 3D models when you're using it in your game engine. I select the body, select the gray color, fill it in again. Do the same for the nose. Select the faces for the eyes again so we can get back to creating the pupil. I didn't even change my brush to a harder brush. Now we can actually do that since the brush is a soft brush right now. At the top, just scroll and go to the fall off and select this bracket looking icon. And that helps create a harder brush. Before we start messing around with pupils that we like, always save your textures. Otherwise, when you press undo, all of it's going to go away. You can get frustrated. I've done this so many times where I filled everything in with various different colors. All of that work goes away because I was trying to do something cool by creating some cool shading or some cool pupils, but pressing undo a lot. Be sure to do that. Save your textures. You don't have to worry about that. Now that the texture is saved, we can start messing around with a pupil size that we like. You can see with the eyes, using the cube and the subdivision surface modifier, we're able to fill in the textures much more smoother because of the way the faces are appearing for the eyes. Since I selected the 4 faces in the middle, I can only paint within those 4 faces. That's why maybe I should unselect those 4 faces and just select all the faces instead to give us more room to create the pupils. That's what I did. Back into edit mode to select all the faces again. This way I have a little bit more freedom to create the pupils of any size because I can just paint directly on top. This actually gives us some pretty high quality pupils. Originally, when we did it with the UV sphere, I was trying to scale down the circular edges to get more of a high quality texture. With these eyes, I don't have to do that. Possibly, it's better to use a cube with a subdivision surface modifier. That way your mesh has faces that are pretty straightforward and you just have to apply your different textures right on top. It'll look exactly like how you're painting with the draw tool. When I paint the pupil at this bottom corner of the eye, it actually gives us some sort of mad look for the character, which I didn't mean to do, but that's because we have a curve-ish for the right of the eye. So that texture paint is going to curve a little bit. It actually looks pretty cool if I decide to give this character a mean look, or maybe there would be a second character with a mean look, or the eyes can have a mean look in some sort of different scenario in my game. But for now, we're just trying to get the pupil as close as possible to the reference. It's just probably better to make the pupil right in the middle. The pupil still looks a little bit too small. I'm increasing the brush size, switching between Expy mode just to make sure it looks identical. I have to make the decision on whether I like the left eye or the right eye because one of the eyes is bigger than the other. I can either have big pupils or small pupils. That's not a hard choice, but you still have to make a choice at the end of the day. I decided to go with big pupils. I select the head, go to texture paint. We're going to need to draw a smile for character 3.1, Bear. I'm just looking at the smile in X-ray mode, back into solid mode. In X-ray mode, I can just trace on my mesh based on the reference to get this smile. But it has to be symmetric, otherwise it's going to look weird. I could mirror this process, but I was practicing with my mouse to get the stroke correct. Trust me, using your mouse is pretty hard to texture paint, but you get pretty used to it. If you're doing some simple texture painting like I am for the eyes, there's this white gloss, like some sort of shine that happens on your eye. At least for characters, I like to add that as a additional finishing off. It just makes your character look a little bit better. It's like a polishing tip for your characters. It's like a light source that appears. Like when you have a ring light, most likely you have this shine that appears over your eyes. It's like that in a sense. This is where I decided to put that white circle for the eyes. This looks pretty good for character 3.1. Since I like the textures for the face, let's just save this one. Look at that. Character 3.1 Bear looks like a happy bear. You see, the facial expression changes a lot as well because now it changes the mood of the game. This is a happy bear. That still works with the 2 scenarios that I mentioned earlier for like different game ideas. These are all various things that I'm keeping tabs of for this character as we get to thinking about what game to make for this character. These are all things that I'm thinking about at this very moment. That's why it's important to note down all the ideas you have because it might come in handy when you have a creative block. You can actually look at your notes to see what ideas you were coming up with throughout the entire process. That helps you avoid that creative block. When you save everything all towards the end, you're using way too much brain power. I like to just go with the flow. As I'm going down each process, I'm going to obviously think of different things. Those different things lead to different paths that I can take this character. The only way you can see all of the directions to take this character is by actually putting it in front of you visually, whether that's creating a sketch or in written form where you just write down notes, or in video form where you have everything recorded like I'm doing right now. I'm just laying down all the ideas as much as possible in whatever formats. Later, I can review all of this and decide what's best for this character. That's how my creative process works. I don't know how it works for a lot of people. Quite possibly, I'm not the only one that thinks like this. It just has to be natural. Otherwise, if you force it, then you're just going to have no ideas. You're just trying to force something that isn't trying to happen. It has to happen naturally. At least that's how I think about it for the entire creative process. You have to be doing other things to get sort of all these ideas. Like for this character, I didn't have any of these ideas when I was creating the sketch or the 3D model. I'm getting way more ideas just narrating the Blender video. This happens way after this entire process of the Blender process. That's why you can't really beat yourself up during different parts of the process, because you're thinking of different things. Like when I created this character, my mind was elsewhere. It was just trying to finish this 3D model, trying to get the body right, get the head right, make everything symmetric, all that stuff. That's where my mind was occupied. But now that all that's done, I don't have to think about that. Right now, I just have to think about, okay, what should I say about this character? What can I narrate about this entire process? I don't have to focus my attention on that. Other than demonstrating what I did to create this character, in this entire process, I'm actually generating various different ideas. That's happening because I'm actually just in my natural flow. I'm just talking, which is a normal thing that we all normally do. We just talk. But in your conversations, there are various different things that you say that are going to be important for the character. That's why you should actually note it down. That's why I like narrating now, because I have various different ideas that happen. I normally don't get into this flow unless I'm talking. It's like I'm having a conversation and I'm just bouncing ideas off to someone else. But at the same time, I'm actually just talking to a screen. I'm actually talking to myself. So this is funny. I'm technically having a meeting with myself right now on what ideas I should have for this character. It's funny that I put it that way, but it's actually what's happening. So that's why it's cool to record everything that you do. You can actually review what you talked about and then see what ideas came about. That finishes the texture paint for this character. I actually didn't fill in the different shading for like the shirt or the pants during that time. I probably didn't think about it. I just decided to just make the entire body just gray. You can see that I'm missing also the shading within the ears. The ears aren't just gray. If you look at the sketch, there's actually some shading to separate the outer ear from the inner ear. So I didn't even do that. I probably just tried to do this as quick as possible because I was trying to teach myself a routine of waking up every day and making sure I create some characters and get through the Blender process. That's a lengthy process. In order to teach yourself, you have to be hands-on and do it every day until it's second nature, a part of your muscle memory. That's what was on my mind as I was creating this character. This was actually character 3.1. So I already created many characters before that. Definitely check that out on how I got to this point for character 3.1, Bear. Check out the previous videos. You see how my process changes all the way up into this character. I'm just getting started. I like to do things and build momentum, which helps me get more excited about each character, but also everything that I do. This is a lot of work, but at the same time, it's actually fun for me. When it's fun, I'm not really using too much energy. It just feels like I'm just creating something and I don't really get tired. Let's just put it that way. When it's fun, I don't get tired. But when it requires a lot of mental power and a lot of physical power, then I get tired. So you can actually teach yourself this if you just do it every day. Try your best to push the boundaries on what you can do daily. All the stuff that you learn will just become easier and easier. That's how I got to this point. I'm not saying it's super easy. It's getting more familiar to me. I don't have to learn as much as I did before. I'm just adding on different techniques now on top of what I know. I'm just going to be showcasing that in every video. Hopefully every video is different and you guys can learn this. For some reason, this is going to be a very long video, but at the same time, I like long videos. You can actually learn a lot about someone's thought process and how they do things. I really like this character to be able to showcase that. I'm going to try my best to condense this as much as possible. The entire time is a very long one. Hopefully editing this video is not going to give me too many issues. Anyways, back to character 3.1 brings us into animation. All right, since we have a humanoid body for character 3.1, Bear, we can actually use Mixamo. What we need to do is is export this in FBX, select armature and mesh, check selected objects, rename this to character 3_1_ full mesh, or whatever you can think of that helps you be organized on what this FBX is. Keep everything else the same and click export FBX in your folder. Go to Mixamo, upload your character, click upload character, drag in your FBX. This is going to replace your previous character that you used. Mixamo only lets you import one character at a time. I don't think you can save all your characters. You always have to go through this auto rigging process. Make sure you save all the animations that you liked for your previous characters, or you're going to have to re-drag it in and auto rig it again. For the auto rigger, we have to drag the blue marker to the chin, the green marker for the wrists, the yellow marker for the elbows, the red marker to the groin. You're going to eyeball this based on your character. Make sure your mesh has pretty clear body parts that match these markers. That way it makes your rigging process much more smoother. Your meshes won't be all over the place. When it's done rigging, click next. It's going to spin during this auto rigging process. This part actually looks pretty cool. It reminds me of scenarios where they scan the different characters. You get a final rig character. It does this head rotation just so you get an idea of what your mesh is going to look like. You can zoom, you can rotate, you can pan around this view to see if this is what you like before you click next. That's pretty good. So next, and you can see the mesh is in the floor. So it's only showing our head. This is because our origin most likely was incorrect for the character, or something within Blender on where our positions of our 3D meshes. That would be the reason why it's like this. We probably have to go in Blender and apply all transforms to make sure the origin and all that is correct. But I probably didn't do that. I probably just forgot. You still save this rigged model by downloading, change from T-pose to original pose, click download, rename this to Mixamo. That way we can distinguish between our full mesh, which was from Blender, and the Mixamo one, which is from Mixamo. That's how I separate it. This is going to be confusing if you don't know what your different FBXs are. Back into Blender. Also, you don't have to do this process if you don't want to. You can just download your meshes from Mixamo and then just import it into your game engine, and it'll work that way too. This is just an extra thing that I did to understand this process of bringing the Mixamo animations into Blender so that I know how to do that for different characters if I needed to. Maybe I want to use the animations inside of Blender and not inside of a game engine. I'm just using it for like animation purposes and creating some sort of scene. That's why I wanted to learn this process. It's good to learn if that's something in your list of things to learn. You can skip this if you want, but this is for my learning purposes and also to review what I did. I select the Mixamo FBX import. This brings in the FBX from Mixamo. The difference between this one is that it's rigged. We have that armature, which is basically the bones. You can see the origin point is in the middle where the neck is, which is incorrect, but that's okay. This is how I would fix that. Just delete your armature. If you delete it with the delete option, it's going to leave the leftover meshes. You don't want to do that because now you have to do extra work of deleting those. Instead, what you want to do is delete the hierarchy, and that deletes the entire armature along with the meshes that were included inside of the FBX file. I expand the character 3.1 folder, select all the separate objects. You can see our origin point is where the neck is. That's why it shows up like that in Mixamo. What we need to do is move this up so that the feet is right above the x-axis, which is the red line, and then export this, selecting the full mesh. We're going to need to import this again in Mixamo, dragging the correct markers on top. Every time you drag the markers, obviously the rigging is going to be different. It's not going to make a big difference, but it's always going to change how the rigging is going to look for your characters. Try not to do this process too many times. It's not that much noticeable unless you really look at your characters close up like that. Most likely, I can't really tell. Just re-download the Mixamo FBX with the new FBX imported into Blender. Now you have the correct character that's rigged. I select the armature, check in front so that we can see all the bones. The feet is a little bit weird. It's slanted. We can move this to correct it in edit mode. And I'm just straightening it out by moving it into place, making sure the roll of the bone is correct as well. Just aligning this much better than how Mixamo aligned it. That's because we have different toes, but probably just rigged it a certain way. That's okay. We can always fix things inside of Blender. This is going to work regardless. You want to look at the bones in different perspectives. Look at it on a side view. Try to align it to your foot as best as possible. You could just keep the bones the same. Originally, it works regardless. When I'm looking at these hands, it seems to only have 2 hands rigged. I guess that bothered me in this point of the video. Not sure why, but I know in Mixamo you can have 3 chain fingers. That's why I redragged the FBX into Mixamo again. This is where I like to try different things. I know after you apply your different markers on your character to rig it, under skeleton LOD, you can change the option of standard skeleton to 3 chain fingers. Now, I don't know why that bothered me at the point. That's actually a good thing because now we can actually learn what that actually does. I'm noticing that there's values for these different options now, which I didn't know before. Possibly the value is the amount of bones that are applied for each selection. That's interesting. I never really looked at that. I should actually look into, oh, it actually says that there's 49 joints. That's what the value is. That's actually super useful because in build blocks, we're actually limited to the amount of joints that we have to use for animations. I'm trying the 3 chain fingers just to see how that looks in terms of the different joints that are available for us. To me, it doesn't really look that different for the hands. Quite possibly it is. I download this FBX. I'm just replacing the one that I saved just to keep everything organized. Otherwise, we're going to have a bunch of FBXs and I wouldn't know what each one did. So I re-import this new FBX from Mixamo. Let's see what the fingers look like. Since I did that, all the chains we did for the feet are reverted back to the previous way it looked. Now we have to reorganize those bones again. That's why if you're constantly dropping things back into Mixamo and reorganizing your bones, make sure to reorganize your bones only if this is the final rig you plan to use. Otherwise, you're gonna have to redo everything again. And that's doing redundant work over again, which doesn't make sense. You're just spending more time doing the same thing. It doesn't really help you much. I guess you're practicing with organizing the bones, you can say, but that's entirely up to you, whatever works. The hand bones actually look pretty much the same. I don't see anything different from the standard bones. I'm just organizing it now to better fit the hands. This is probably the final rig that I want to use. We're going to pose mode, go to conversion under Expy kit. This is a add-on that I was using to help with the process of extracting the meta rig and getting the animations into Blender from Mixamo. Under Expy kit, go to conversion, extract meta rig, expand this. Rig type is Mixamo. That actually does something weird with the mesh and the rig. It looks like it's separated the bones with the body and the head and the eyes, I guess. That's kind of interesting. I didn't notice that. The rig type, I put Rigify controls. That's not supposed to happen when I extract the meta rig like that. I was probably confused on why this process didn't work. We did it with the last character. I wanted to see how I achieved this with the last character. I went to my old videos for character 2.5 bug boots because that's where I actually applied this process. The thing I forgot to do in this process was selecting the armature along with the separate models and then making sure to apply all transforms. That resets the 90 degrees in the rotation and also the location information as well. That's a step that I missed during this process with Expy kit. After you apply the transforms, back to pose mode, go to conversion, extract meta rig. The rig type is Mixamo. It always adds these additional hand bones. I delete them along with these breast bones and the pelvis bones. It looks like it added some bones for the feet in pose mode. I thought I couldn't generate a rig in pose mode. That's interesting. I thought I had to do it in object mode. I regenerated the rig. There's an error. Now I remember we weren't supposed to delete those hand bones. You just leave them there, I guess, even though it looks weird. But you can delete the pelvis bones and the breast bones, which is fine, but just leave everything else. Regenerate the rig. That works. Doing it this way. Go into pose mode and see your different layers. Now I need to find an animation that I like for this character. During this time, I was just experimenting with Mixamo. I haven't really used it much other than with the last character, this being the second character that I used it with. I was unfamiliar with the process, just trying to familiarize myself as best as I can. I decided to select this silly dancing animation that looks pretty funny. I think it works pretty well for character 341, Bear. I download this FBX without the skin. We just get the armature. I move this to my folder, making sure to name it correctly so I know exactly what this file is. I like to just use a similar name to what we've been using for Mixamo, but also add some sort of extension like silly dancing, which is what I selected in Mixamo, so that I remember which one I selected. When you use Mixamo, you always have to redrag in your FBX. It's not always going to save the different keyframe animations that you used. I actually want to remember all the keyframe animations that I'm using so that I can select these for other characters as well. I know exactly where they would be in Mixamo, and I would be able to search it up because I know the name. Back into Blender, we import this FBX, select silly dancing animation. With this Blender file, I have a animation tab that I created. This has the animation editor on the left side as a view. At the bottom, there's a timeline. On the right side, we can see our mesh and select things like the mesh, the armature. This is the animation view that I use. Scroll to the side to see the animation. This is the correct way. You have to make sure to select it in this order, otherwise it won't work. In object mode, select your rig, shift select the armature from the silly dancing, go to pose mode, right click, go to binding, bind to active armature, and bring up this menu to bind, change this to Rigify controls, bind target, change this to Mixamo. If you did this successfully, your rig will bind to that silly dancing animation that you added. Check chain look at, you can see the difference. It just looks better in terms of how the mesh deforms. If you have it checked, make sure to have it checked. Now you have the Mixamo silly dancing animation inside of Blender. In your timeline, you can always select to scene range, just so it loops correctly. Otherwise, if you have it set to 250, you might not have enough animation frames. That's the reason why. To bake this animation, select one of the layers in your rig, right click and go to binding, select constrain controls, right click and go to animation, bake constrained actions. It should show this menu, bake constrained actions, and have a bake and exit button. This part was also confusing. If you don't bake the animation, it actually doesn't show up in your actions correctly. You don't see all the keyframe animations. That's why it's like red. It should also have the keyframe animations in your summary. That's how you know you did this incorrect or not. This animation looks pretty off now, most likely because I did it wrong. This is me trying to troubleshoot this. This part was super confusing. It's always hard to remember the actual processes that I learned and doing it in the correct order, which makes a huge difference. In pose mode, I have the rig selected. Instead, I select one of the bones on the rig with the silly dancing. I right click, go to animation, bake constrained actions. This will produce the correct animation and it should show as action. That's how you know you did it correctly. It's not the armature Mixamo layer one, but it's the one that has the action with a F before it. When you select this one, this will have a summary of all the rig layers with all the bones. I rename this to character 3_1 Mixamo silly dancing. I delete the silly dancing armature that we dragged in because we've already baked those actions on our rig. Now we have character 3.1 Bear doing a silly dancing animation. That's how we get the animations from Mixamo to Blender. That part's a little bit confusing. Hopefully I can actually edit some of the stuff out. To clean up our Blender file, I usually do this. Expand this drop down menu where this photo icon is. Go to Blender file. Here you can delete different things in your Blender file to actually keep it organized. I don't like unnecessary files sometimes. It just makes everything unclear of what I did with those files or makes my Blender file file, super cluttered. After I don't need something, I delete it. We don't need this armature Mixamo layer 0. Right click it, delete it. This keeps our actions in our action editor super clear. You can see we only have the keyframe animation for the silly dancing, which is what I only want in my action editor. We're going to have a bunch of animations there anyways, and you don't want your unnecessary files in there. Make sure to do that. I'm just renaming these separate objects for our mesh. Since it's separated, we need to duplicate all of them to create the outline again. Now, I don't know why I didn't join the separate objects into one. I should have joined them so I don't have to create different outlines for each separate object, but that's okay. You can actually see how I do this. Even though it's tedious, you still have to do it if your objects are separate. Since this is a new file, I have to start over with how I create the outline process. Add a second material, change the surface from Principled BSDF to Emission, change that from white to black, check backface culling. This is how you create the outline material. Go to vertex groups, click the plus, create a group, rename it to outline, add a mask modifier and a solidify modifier. In the mask modifier, under vertex group, add your outline group. Under solidify modifier, add your outline group to shell vertex group, change the material index offset from 0 to 1, check flip normals, check high quality normals, change the offset to 1, increase your thickness to whatever you like, move the solidify modifier above the mask modifier. You'll be able to see your outline. In solid view, it will show up as this white color and it looks like your outline is not there. You actually have to change it to material preview mode. I think that's what the option is. When you do that, you can see your outline applied on your textured 3D model. You can adjust the thickness depending on what you like. You might want a thick lined character or a thin line character. Once you have that set up for the outline, which I only have applied to the body at the moment, what you can do is select the body outline, shift select the eye outline, and then press Ctrl L to link the materials over. Also copy the modifiers. Actually, that's the wrong order. The correct order is select the eye outline and shift select the body outline. Press Ctrl L to copy the modifiers. Also link the materials. We need to do the same for the head. Select the head outline, shift select the eye outline, Ctrl L, link the materials, Ctrl L, copy modifiers. Add an outline group in the vertex groups. Finish off doing the same thing for the nose outline. Select the nose outline, shift select the head outline, copy the modifiers, and link the materials with Ctrl L. This transfers all the data. Add an outline group in vertex groups. Looks a little bit weird for some reason with the Mixamo FBX, but this is correct. You don't have to worry too much about it. When you use it in your game engine, it won't look like this. I forgot how I fixed this actually. It looks like our normals are flipped, but they're not. That's why I checked the face orientation. There's a way to fix it. I just forgot right now, but it still works. In order to export this FBX with the animation, we already have selected objects checked. We already have armature and mesh selected. So we need to change to Z forward. Under armature, uncheck add leaf bones. Under bake animation, uncheck NLA strips. Give this file a name. I named it as animated4.fbx. That's the entire process for using Mixamo for your rigging and animation. That concludes this video, which is going to be a very long video for character 3 part 1, Bear. This is a very important video because it actually is a pretty good explanation and demonstration of the entire process if you wanted to create a character that has a head but also a humanoid body and you wanted to animate that, do it as quick as possible using Mixamo for your rigging and animation purposes. Throughout this entire process, there's various things that you have to select correctly. But if you wanted to bring the animations into Blender to use your Mixamo animations, you have to do a certain way with Expy. This allows you to drag in as many animations you want from Mixamo and have it all in one place inside of Blender. But you can use your animations for creating scenes in Blender. That's one option that's open to you, but doesn't have to do with the game development process. Also, you can use this FBX file either from the Blender project or the Mixamo website with your character, and then use that into Buildbox. Hopefully this video helps. I tried to make it as detailed as possible. I'm gonna condense as much as I can to make it not as long, but I like long videos. I really like people's workflows. This is mine on how I did it with a humanoid character. Hopefully you learned a lot from this video. I'm gonna need to edit this a lot. I tried to make this short, but it's actually gonna be super long. I'm curious how this video actually does though. I appreciate your time. Definitely check out the Buildbox video for character 3.1 Bear Bear. I'm gonna be putting it into Buildbox just with the silly dancing animation, just so that you can see. I'm gonna let you know there's not going to be a mechanic with it just yet. I actually came up with the idea within this video where I might actually build a mechanic with the scenarios that I came up with. I need to go through the video again. I said something about nature, beehives, brown bear for scenario 1. For scenario 2, it was going to be a white bear with toys in a toy store. Possibly I might use those ideas along with his happy face. Possibly might come up with a game mechanic based off of that. That's probably going to come at another time, but the next video is just going to be me dropping it into Buildbox, just getting used to that process. That's what I was doing during this time. Definitely check that out. Appreciate you checking out my videos. Let me know in the comments what you think about my process. Let me know if all of this is helping you out. Definitely want to hear from you guys. I appreciate your time checking out all my videos. Definitely rewatch all that stuff. There's so much nuggets and so much stuff you can learn about my process and how you can apply it to your own. I think that's about it. Please like and subscribe. Thank you. Appreciate it. I'm coining this now and also in the new videos. This is the glitchy way of making characters and creating games. This is how I do it. This is what Glitchy Thumbs is all about. We're creating games the glitchy way. See you in the next video. You know what I'm saying? Peace out.